The morning sun spilled through the towering windows of the FBI headquarters, painting the polished marble floors with streaks of golden light that danced across the surface, like fleeting promises of justice. The building stood as a monument to order and integrity, its massive columns rising toward the sky, exuding an unshakable air of authority. For Lauren Mitchell, crossing its threshold each day was more than a simple commute, it was a quiet victory, a testament to the battles she'd fought and won against a world that often refused to see her worth. She was no stranger to struggle. As the director of the Criminal Investigations Division, Lauren had clawed her way to the top, shattering glass ceilings that weren't built to break, especially not for a black woman like her. Every step she took echoed with purpose, her badge clipped proudly to her blazer, a symbol of the authority she'd earned through years of relentless determination. Lauren carried herself with a grace that masked the fire simmering beneath her surface. Her posture was impeccable, shoulders squared, head held high as if daring anyone to question her right to be there. Her sharp, discerning eyes swept over every detail, missing nothing, while her voice, steady and commanding, could silence a room with a single word. But beneath that poised exterior burned a fierce resolve, a refusal to let the weight of prejudice dictate her destiny. She'd faced it all, the sit-along glances that lingered too long, the thinly veiled doubts about her competence, the whispered assumptions that her success was some fluke, rather than the fruit of her tireless labor. Each slight had stoked the flames within her, forging a strength that propelled her forward. She wasn't just surviving in this world that so often underestimated her, she was thriving, reshaping it with every case she closed, every injustice she unraveled. That morning, like so many others, began with the familiar rhythm of her routine. She strode into the lobby, a steaming coffee in one hand, her tablet tucked under her arm, its screen already glowing with the day's demands. A high-profile briefing loomed at 10, followed by a noon meeting with the deputy director, and then hours of poring over evidence in an ongoing probe into organized crime. The workload was crushing, but Lauren thrived under its pressure. For her, it wasn't just about solving crimes, it was about dismantling the systems that allowed corruption and inequity to fester. Every lead she chased, every detail she scrutinized, was a brick pulled from the foundation of a broken world, a step toward something fairer. Across town, Officer Brad Simmons was beginning his own day, his patrol car cutting through the city streets with the same self-assured swagger he carried in his stride. Brad saw himself as the embodiment of the law, a walking, talking extension of justice itself. His uniform was pristine, the creases sharp enough to cut glass, his badge gleaming like a beacon of his perceived righteousness. To his fellow officers, he was a veteran who got things done, a man who navigated the chaos of the streets with unflinching resolve. But to the community he policed, his presence was a storm cloud, heavy with tension and unspoken threats. Brad prided himself on his instincts, which he believed were infallible, honed by years on the force. Yet those instincts weren't rooted in reason or training. They were tangled in a web of biases, assumptions, and an unshakable sense of superiority that had grown more dangerous with time. For Brad, authority wasn't just a job, it was a weapon. He wielded it with a confidence that teetered on the edge of arrogance, convinced that he alone could maintain order in a world he saw as perpetually teetering toward chaos. Over the years, that belief had hardened into something more sinister, a certainty that he was untouchable, above reproach. He didn't view his actions as prejudice. He told himself he was simply doing his duty, keeping the wrong people in check. If someone got hurt in the process, well, that was their fault for stepping out of line, not his for enforcing it. His world was black and white, and he'd long ago decided where everyone belonged. Their paths were destined to collide on that ordinary Monday morning, though neither could have predicted the storm it would unleash. Lauren arrived at the headquarters early, the lobby buzzing with the usual hum of activity. Agents darted through the halls, their voices a low murmur of urgency as they juggled cases and deadlines. The air smelled faintly of coffee and paper, a comforting backdrop to the chaos of their work. She nodded to a junior agent who offered a quick, respectful "Good morning, Director," before hurrying off with a stack of files. It was a typical day until it wasn't. Meanwhile, Brad was responding to a call that crackled over his radio, a report of a suspicious individual near a federal building. He didn't pause to question the validity of the tipped-out. Wasn't in his nature. His mind was already made up. Whoever it was, they didn't belong. And it was his job to remind them of that. As he sped toward the address, his grip tightened on the steering wheel, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. He relished these moments, the chance to assert control, to put someone in their place. The city blurred past his window, a gray smear of concrete and glass, but his focus was razor-sharp. The confrontation erupted the moment he stormed into the lobby, his boots thudding against the marble with a force that demanded attention. Lauren stood near the reception desk, reviewing a memo on her tablet, her posture relaxed yet regal. The badge on her blazer glinted under the fluorescent lights, a quiet declaration of her place in this world. She barely registered Brad's arrival until his voice sliced through the room like a blade, harsh and accusing. What are you doing here?" he barked, his tone dripping with contempt. Heads turned, secretaries froze mid-typing, agents paused mid-step, curiosity mingling with unease. Lauren's eyes lifted slowly from her tablet, meeting his gaze with a calm that belied the sudden tension coiling in her chest. She didn't flinch. With a deliberate movement, she slid her badge forward, holding it out for him to see, her fingers steady despite the insult hanging in the air. He didn't even glance at it. "I asked you a question," he snapped, stepping closer, his hand resting on his belt in a way that felt less like protocol and more like a threat. "People like you don't just wander into places like this without a reason. What are you doing here?" The room seemed to hold its breath, time stretching thin in the heavy silence that followed. Lauren's voice, when it came, was a quiet thunder, unshaken and resolute. "I work here." The words landed like a stone in still water, rippling outward. But Brad's response was a bitter, barking laugh that bounced off the walls. "Work here? Sure you do," he sneered, his eyes raking over her with undisguised scorn. "Let me guess, cleaning staff, maintenance. Maybe you're delivering something. Let me see some real ID, not this whatever this is." He flicked a dismissive hand toward her badge, as if it were a child's toy, his disdain a thick, suffocating fog. Lauren felt the first crack in her composure, a twitch in her brow, a heat rising in her chest, but she held herself together, a pillar of restraint. "That badge grants me access to every floor of this building," she said, her voice still even, though the fire behind it was unmistakable. "It identifies me." As he cut her off, his patience unraveling like a frayed thread. "Enough," he growled, closing the distance between them until he loomed over her, his posture radiating menace. "I don't know what kind of scam you're running, but I'm not buying it. You need to leave, now." Her eyes locked onto his, a tempest swirling within them, the insult, the assumption. The sheer gall of it burned through her like wildfire, scorching every nerve. She opened her mouth to speak, to unleash the fury clawing at her throat, but he didn't give her the chance. His hand shot out, seizing her arm with a grip so tight it made her stumble, her coffee splashing to the floor in a dark, steaming puddle. Gasps erupted from the onlookers. A receptionist clutched her phone. An agent hesitated mid-stride, but no one moved. Fear and indecision paralyzed them as Brad snarled, "You're resisting now," dragging her toward the exit. "Let's take this outside. I don't need your kind causing a scene here." The words hit harder than his grip, each syllable laced with venom, steeped in a history of hatred she'd spent her life defying. Her anger surged, a tidal wave crashing against the dam of her self-control. But before she could fight back, he shoved her through the glass doors. She staggered onto the sidewalk, the cold air biting at her skin as the humiliation settled over her like a shroud. "I'll be filing a report on this," she managed, her voice trembling with fear, but with a rage so deep it shook her to her core. "You have no idea what you're doing." Brad leaned in close, his smirk a jagged edge of ice. "Oh, I know exactly what I'm doing," he said, his breath hot against her ear. "And I know what you're doing too, trying to play a role you're not meant for. Good luck with that." He turned on his heel and strode back inside, leaving her standing there, her heart hammering against her ribs, her fingers brushing the badge still pinned to her blazer. In that moment, something crystallized within her. This wasn't over. not by a long shot. What Brad couldn't have known what his arrogance blinded him to was the weight of the badge he'd so casually dismissed. It wasn't just a piece of metal, it was a key to power far beyond his own, a mark of authority that could unravel his world thread by thread. Lauren wasn't just any employee, she was a force, a reckoning waiting to descend. As she stood on that sidewalk, the wind tugging at her coat, she made a silent vow he would face the consequences of his actions, and they would be as unrelenting as the justice she'd sworn to uphold. Brad, oblivious to the storm he'd ignited, returned to his routine, his chest puffed with the smug satisfaction of a man who believed he'd won. But the tables were turning, slowly and inexorably, driven by a woman whose strength he couldn't fathom. How far would she go to ensure he paid for his hubris? How devastating would the fallout be when the truth of her identity and her resolve came crashing down? The lesson was clear. Power abused is power lost, and justice, when wielded by someone like Lauren, cuts deeper than any blade. The echoes of this encounter would ripple far beyond that lobby, a stark reminder that no one, not even a man cloaked in a uniform, stands above accountability. The morning sun spilled through the towering windows of the office building, casting long shadows across the marble floors of the lobby. Lauren stood just beyond her office door, her chest tight with the weight of a day that had barely begun. She adjusted the crisp lines of her blazer, her fingers brushing over the badge pinned firmly to its lapel, a symbol of years spent clawing her way through a world that often refused to make room for her. She was no stranger to responsibility. It was a mantle she wore with quiet pride, a steady fire that fueled her every decision. But even the strongest flames flicker under pressure, and today she craved a moment of reprieve. With a deep breath, she pushed through the glass doors, stepping into the brisk air of the bustling street outside. For a fleeting second, the chaos of her world softened, the hum of traffic and distant voices blending into a rare stillness she seldom allowed herself to feel. Across the street, tires squealed against the curb as Brad's car lurched to a stop. His hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles whitening as his mind churned with a storm of assumptions. He'd been driving with purpose that morning, his thoughts tangled in a web of self-righteous certainty. He was a man who thrived on control, who saw the world through a lens of absolutes, right and wrong, power and submission. When his gaze landed on Lauren, stepping out into the open, something in him snapped into focus. She stood there, poised and professional, her shoulders squared with an effortless authority that seemed to ripple through the air around her. But to Brad, she was a trespasser in a space he'd claimed as his own. Her composure, her confidence, it didn't matter. He didn't see the badge glinting under the morning light, or perhaps he did and chose to dismiss it, his vision clouded by a prejudice so ingrained it felt like truth. Lauren sensed him before she saw him. The screech of his brakes cut through the quiet she'd been clinging to, and her instinction by years of navigating tense encounters kicked in. She turned slightly, her eyes catching the figure emerging from the car. Brad stepped out with a swagger that oozed defiance, his boots hitting the pavement with a deliberate thud. He was broad-shouldered, his uniform crisp, but it was the energy he carried that struck her hardest. A coiled, aggressive force she'd faced too many times before. Her stomach tightened, not with fear but with a weary recognition. She didn't know this man, but she knew his type, and she braced herself for the inevitable. Their collision began with words sharp and jagged like shards of glass. Brad's voice sliced through the air, thick with contempt as he demanded to know what she was doing there, who she thought she was. His tone dripped with disdain, each syllable a challenge to her very existence in that moment. Lauren's response was a study in restraint, her voice low and measured as she tried to steer the exchange toward reason. She wasn't naive, she knew men like him rarely listened, but she held on to the hope that clarity might pierce his arrogance. It didn't. Brad's eyes narrowed, his assumptions hardening with every word she spoke. That badge on her blazer? To him, it was a prop, a meaningless trinket he refused to acknowledge. His judgment was a wall, impenetrable and unyielding, and reason had no place within it. The tension escalated in a heartbeat. Brad's hand shot out, closing around her arm with a grip that was both sudden and brutal. The force of it sent a jolt through her, a shock wave that reverberated in the widening eyes of the onlookers who had begun to gather. Gasps rippled through the small crowd. A delivery man, frozen mid-step. A woman clutching her coffee cup a little tighter, but no one moved to intervene. Lauren's breath caught, not from pain, but from the raw humiliation that surged within her. Hot and bitter, yet even as it burned, her composure held. Her voice remained steady, cutting through the haze of his aggression as she told him, firmly, that he had no right to touch her, no authority to treat her this way. Her words were a lifeline, a tether to the dignity he sought to strip from her. But Brad was deaf to them. He was lost in his own story, a narrative where he was the hero and she the villain, too blinded by his own warped lens to see the truth standing before him. Then, as quickly as it had ignited, the confrontation fizzled out. Brad released her arm with a scoff, turning on his heel and striding back to his car. His chest puffed with a smugness that made Lauren's blood boil. He drove off, leaving her standing on the sidewalk, her breaths coming fast and heavy, her hands trembling with a fury she rarely allowed herself to feel. The crowd dispersed, their whispers trailing behind them like smoke. But for Lauren, the moment lingered. It wasn't just an insult, it was a wound, a stark reminder of the battles she'd fought her entire life, battles she'd sworn to never stop fighting. As she straightened her blazer and smoothed her expression, a resolve hardened within her. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The air in her office felt stifling that afternoon, thick with the echoes of the morning's clash. Lauren sat at her desk. The polished wood cool beneath her fingertips as they drummed a restless rhythm. Her mind replayed every detailed sneer on Brad's face, the weight of his hand on her arm, the casual cruelty in his voice. It wasn't just a memory, it was a wound that pulsed with every beat of her heart, a stinging reminder of how fragile respect could be in the face of unchecked power. She'd spent decades building her career, brick by brick, earning her place through grit and unrelenting determination. To have it all reduced to nothing by a man too arrogant to see her worth it gnawed at her. A quiet rage simmering beneath her calm exterior. The door creaked open and Emily stepped inside, her steps tentative as if she could sense the storm brewing in the room. She was young, barely past her mid-20s, with wide eyes and a nervous energy that softened under Lauren's steady gaze. Emily had been her assistant for 2 years, long enough to read the subtle shifts in her boss's demeanor. Today, she saw the cold fire in Lauren's eyes, the tight line of her jaw, and knew something seismic was unfolding. Clutching a tablet, its screen alive with notifications, Emily approached the desk with care. "I've got the surveillance footage from the lobby," she said softly, setting the device down. "It's all there, every second of it." Lauren's gaze flicked to the screen, her breath catching as she pressed play. The grainy footage unfolded like a slow-motion nightmare, Brad's towering figure looming over her, his hand clamping down on her arm, his lips curling with disdain as he spat his venomous words. She watched herself to her steady posture. Her measured responsing felt a flicker of pride amidst the anger. She paused the video, leaning back in her chair, her mind racing through a labyrinth of options. This wasn't just about her pride or her pain. It was about justice, about dismantling the culture that let men like Brad wield power without consequence. "Thank you, Emily," she said at last, her voice firm but laced with a quiet intensity. "Send this to Internal Affairs. I want his full disciplinary history, and get legal on the line. We're not letting this fade away." Emily nodded, her own resolve strengthening as she absorbed the weight of Lauren's words. She slipped out of the room, leaving Lauren alone with her thoughts. The process was Clearport's, investigations, accountability beneath it all. A deeper truth gnawed at her. This wasn't just one man's arrogance. It was a system that had turned a blind eye, a complacency that had let his behavior fester. As she stared at the frozen image on the tablet, Lauren vowed to drag it all into the light, no matter the cost. Meanwhile, across town, Brad lounged in the precinct break room, his laughter echoing off the chipped linoleum walls. He leaned back in his chair, recounting the morning's triumph to a pair of colleagues, a weary officer with a crooked grin, and Mike, older and quieter, his eyes darting nervously as Brad spoke. "You should have seen her," Brad crowed, his voice brimming with bravado. "Thought she owned the place. I put her right back where she belonged." Tom chuckled, though his laugh faltered, a flicker of unease crossing his face. Mike stayed silent, his fingers tightening around his coffee mug before he mumbled an excuse and slipped out of the room. Brad didn't notice, too caught up in his own glory to see the cracks forming around him. That afternoon, the call came. Brad sauntered into the captain's office, his usual cockiness intact, expecting a slap on the wrist at most. But the air was different, charged with something he couldn't place. Captain Hargrove sat behind his desk, his face carved from stone. His eyes locked on Brad with an intensity that made the younger man falter. "Sit," Hargrove said. His voice clipped. Brad obeyed, a frown tugging at his lips as he sank into the chair. "There's been a complaint," the captain began, his words deliberate. "From someone very high up." Brad snorted, leaning back with a smirk. "Let me guess, that woman from this morning. She's blowing it out of proportion. You know how they get." Hargrove's gaze darkened, and Brad shifted, the first tendrils of doubt creeping in. "That woman," the captain said slowly, each word a hammer strike, "is the director of the FBI's Criminal Investigations Division. We've got footage of you grabbing her, Simmons. It's ugly for you, for this department." The room went still, the weight of the revelation crashing over Brad like a tidal wave. His mouth opened, a protest forming, but Hargrove cut him off. "You crossed a line, and there will be consequences." For the first time, Brad's unshakable confidence wavered, the shield of his badge cracking under the reality he'd refused to face. Back at her desk, Lauren was a force in motion. She'd spent hours degangsitizing complaints, buried reports, a trail of misconduct that stretched back years. Each document was a thread, weaving a tapestry of Brad's arrogance and the system's failure to hold him accountable. Her fingers flew across her keyboard, her mind sharp and relentless. This wasn't just about one morning, it was about every moment of injustice he'd inflicted, every life he'd diminished with his unchecked power. By evening, the whispers had grown louder, spreading through the corridors of power. Conversations sparked, calls were made, and the machinery of justice groaned to life. Brad had unleashed a storm, and Lauren, with her quiet fury and unshakable resolve, was its eye, a force of reckoning he could never have foreseen. The lesson was clear: power, when abused, carries a price. Brad had wielded his authority like a weapon, blind to the consequences. But justice, though slow, was relentless. For Lauren, it was a bitter victory, a reminder that the fight for fairness was never truly one, just waged, one battle at a time. And as the fallout loomed, its shadow stretching far beyond that single morning, it laid bare a truth as old as time: those who trample others in their climb often find the ground crumbling beneath them, pulled down by the very hands they sought to crush. The air in the city that evening felt thick, charged with a restless energy that seemed to cling to every corner of the streets. Whispers of indignation had begun to ripple through the tight-knit circles of the law enforcement community, sparked by a piece of footage from a lobby camera recording that, while still shielded from the public eye, had found its way into the hands of those who wielded quiet but undeniable influence. The images it captured were raw, unfiltered, and impossible to dismiss. And at the center of it all stood Lauren Mitchell, a woman whose authority was matched only by her unyielding determination. She wasn't just a figurehead, she was a force, and her refusal to let this incident fade into the shadows ensured that the world was watching, holding its breath, waiting to see what would unfold next. For Brad Simmons, the world he'd once known, a world of unshakable certainty and predictable routines, was fraying at the edges, unraveling thread by thread. He sat alone in his dimly lit living room that night, the glow of a single lamp casting long, jagged shadows across the walls. His mind churned like a storm at sea, waves of fury crashing against jagged cliffs of fear, all undercut by a stubborn refusal to accept the reality closing in around him. How had it come to this? Just days ago, he'd been untouchable, his badge a shield, his authority unquestioned. His colleagues, who for years had shrugged off his brash demeanor and overlooked his heavy-handed tactics, were now stepping back, their faces turned away as if he carried some contagion they dared not catch. The captain's voice still echoed in his ears, clipped and cold, announcing an internal review and his immediate suspension to administrative leave. Brad's fingers tightened around the armrest of his chair, knuckles paling as he replayed the events in his head. He hadn't done anything wrong. He told himself. He'd just been doing his job, keeping order, asserting control. Wasn't that what they expected of him? But across town, Lauren Mitchell was only beginning to dig in. The night stretched out before her, dark and endless, as she stood by the window of her office. The city skyline, a constellation of flickering lights below. Her reflection stared back at her from the glass-harp jawline, steady eyes. A woman who carried the weight of her position like a mantle she'd forged herself. She knew the days ahead would be a crucible, a test not just of her resolve but of the system itself. Every move she made now would ripple outward, shaping how this moment would be etched into memory. It wasn't enough to seek justice for what had happened. She needed to carve a deeper truth into the bedrock of this city, warning that no one, not even those cloaked in the trappings of power or shielded by a uniform, could stand above the law. The tension hung heavy, a storm brewing on the horizon, and as Brad's arrogance had propelled him this far, it was now dragging him toward a reckoning he could no longer escape. Lauren, with her iron will and unrelenting focus, was prepared to see this through, no matter how brutal the end might be. The pieces were falling into place, the stakes climbing higher with every passing hour, and soon, the full weight of the truth would come crashing down, leaving no one untouched. The hearing room, when the day finally arrived, was quieter than Lauren had imagined it would be. The silence wasn't peaceful, it was dense, oppressive, like the air before a thunderstorm breaks. Rows of chairs stretched along the walls, occupied by a mix of uniformed officers and a handful of civilians in muted suits, their faces a gallery of guarded expressions. At the front, a long table dominated the space, its surface lined with microphones that gleamed under the sterile fluorescent lights, each one poised like a sentinel awaiting the words that would decide Brad's fate. Behind it sat the panel of investigators, their stern faces carved from stone, giving nothing away. Lauren lingered near the back of the room, her presence a quiet thunderhead, drawing eyes without a single word. She'd chosen silence for now, content to watch the scene unfold like a predator surveying its territory. This wasn't her fight to wage directly, and Morst lit the spark, set the machinery in motion, and now it was up to the system to prove its worth, or reveal its flaws. Brad Simmons sat at the center table, his posture stiff as a board, his jaw clenched so tightly it seemed it might crack under the strain. His uniform was pristine, the badge pinned to his chest catching the light with a mocking shine. But the swagger he'd once worn like a second skin was gone, stripped away by the weight of the moment. His eyes, usually sharp with defiance, flickered nervously, darting to the corners of the room as if searching for a lifeline, a familiar face, anything to tether him to the confidence he'd lost. But the room offered no refuge. His allies had vanished, leaving him isolated in a sea of scrutiny. The lead investigator, a man with silver threading through his hair and a voice that carried the calm authority of someone who'd seen it all, leaned forward, his chair creaking faintly under the shift. He cleared his throat, and the room seemed to freeze, every rustle of fabric and shallow breath halting as if on command. "Officer Simmons," he began, his tone measured but firm, "this hearing is not a trial. Let that be clear. It is, however, a formal inquiry into your actions on the morning of October 14th. You're here to address a reported misuse of authority and allegations of misconduct. Do you fully grasp the seriousness of what's being leveled against you?" Brad nodded, a jerky motion that betrayed his nerves, his hands gripping the table's edge as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. When he spoke, his voice was rough, laced with a defiance that sounded more desperate than convincing. "I do, sir. But with all due respect, I was just doing my job. Everything I did that day, it was within my rights, my authority." The investigator's expression didn't flicker, his composure a wall of practiced neutrality. He reached for the file in front of him, fingers brushing the edges of the pages as he opened it with deliberate care. "We've reviewed the surveillance footage, Officer Simmons," he said, his voice steady as steel. "It paints a different picture. You approached a civilian outside a federal building, dismissed her identification when she presented it, and then escalated the situation without cause. This wasn't just anyone. Ash had every right to be there, and her position places her far above you in the chain of command. Why did you ignore her credentials?" Brad shifted in his seat, his knuckles whitening as his grip tightened. Sweat beaded faintly along his hairline, and his voice came out strained, faltering. I didn't recognize her, sir. She didn't look like she belonged there. Not dressed the way she was, not in a place like that. A sharp, collective intake of breath rippled through the room, subtle but piercing, hanging in the air like a blade. Lauren felt a spark of fury ignite in her chest, hot and fierce, but she held herself still, her face a mask of iron calm. The investigator let the silence stretch, heavy and deliberate, before he spoke again. Didn't look like she belonged, he echoed, each word slow and precise, as if tasting their bitterness. Explain that, Officer Simmons. What does someone who belongs look like, in your estimation? Brad's confidence crumbled visibly, his mouth opening and then closing again, his face flushing a deep, uneven red. I didn't mean it like that, he stammered, his voice shrinking. I just meant she didn't have the usual look of someone with authority, that's all. The investigator's gaze sharpened, though his tone remained level, cutting deeper for its restraint. So you assumed, he pressed, you assumed that a black woman standing outside a federal building couldn't possibly hold a position of power. Is that what you're telling us? Brad didn't answer, his silence roaring louder than any defense he might have mustered. He stared down at the table, his once proud shoulders hunching inward, his arrogance dissolving into something that might have been shamier. Perhaps just the cold grip of fear. The investigator didn't relent. Let me clarify this for you, he said, his voice rising just enough to fill the room. The woman you disrespected, whose badge you dismissed without a second thought, is Director Lauren Mitchell. She oversees one of the most vital divisions in the FBI, and yet you treated her like a trespasser, a criminal, based on nothing but your own snap judgment. Do you comprehend the magnitude of what you've done now, Officer Simmons? Before Brad could muster a response, a new sound sliced through the stillness, harp, deliberate, the click of heels against tile. Lauren stepped forward, her movements steady and purposeful, drawing every eye in the room like a magnet. The air seemed to tighten as she approached the table, her presence a storm contained in human form. With all due respect, she began, her voice low but resonant, carrying the weight of every unspoken thought she'd harbored until this moment. I don't think he does understand. If he did, he wouldn't be sitting there, still clinging to excuses, still refusing to own what he did. Brad's head jerked up, his eyes locking onto hers. For a fleeting second, defiance flared in his gaze, a spark of the man he'd been, but it withered under the unyielding strength of her stare. She pressed on, her tone cutting like a blade yet tempered with control. This isn't just about me, Officer Simmons. This is about every person you've stepped on, every assumption you've wielded like a weapon, every time you've twisted the power you were given into something ugly and unjust. You didn't just disrespect me that day, you spat on the badge you wear, the oath you swore, and the very ideals you claim to uphold, and I won't let that stand unchallenged. The room fell silent, her words settling like a heavy fog, wrapping around everyone present. Brad opened his mouth as if to argue, but nothing came out his voice, his bravado, swallowed by the truth she'd laid bare. The investigator cleared his throat, a small sound that broke the spell just enough to move forward. Thank you, Director Mitchell, he said, his tone carrying a quiet respect. Your statement is noted and will be part of the final report. Lauren gave a curt nod, stepping back to her place, her eyes never leaving the scene. The hearing pressed on, but the tide had turned irrevocably. Brad's defenses lay in ruins, his excuses exposed as hollow shells. The footage, the questions, the weight of Lauren's wordful of it bore down on him, unrelenting. By the time the session drew to a close, his career teetered on the edge of collapse, and the panel's final remarks only underscored the inevitable. As the room began to empty, Lauren lingered near the exit, watching as Brad shuffled out, his shoulders slumped, his face a hollow mask. He didn't meet her gaze, and for the first time, she saw not the arrogance that had defined him, but a flicker of fear, a man confronted by the consequences of his own making. In that moment, satisfaction didn't come to her. Instead, a deeper resolve took root, steady and unshakable. This wasn't the end, it was a beginning. Justice wasn't just about punishing one man, it was about dismantling the rot that let him thrive. about proving that power unchecked would always meet its reckoning. Brad's fall was a lesson, a stark reminder etched in the silence of that hearing room. No one escapes the consequences of abusing what they've been given, and Lauren would ensure that message endured long after the echoes of this day faded. As the sun sank beneath the horizon, painting the city in hues of amber and violet, long shadows stretched across the precinct like silent sentinels, bearing witness to the day's reckoning. Inside the locker room, where the air hung heavy with the musky tang of perspiration and the faint creak of weathered leather, Brad Simmons sat alone. The dim glow of a flickering overhead light cast jagged patterns across his hunched form. His head rested in his trembling hands, fingers digging into his scalp as though he could claw away the suffocating burden that pressed against his chest. The echoes of the hearing reverberated in his mind, sharp, accusatory questions slicing through his defenses, grainy footage replaying his missteps in unforgiving clarity, and the steady, piercing voice of Lauren Mitchell cutting deeper than any blade. Her words clung to him, inescapable, her unflinching gaze stripping away the armor of bravado he'd worn for so long. She hadn't just seen him, she'd seen through him, exposing the raw, jagged edges he'd spent years pretending didn't exist. The door groaned open, its rusty hinges protesting against the stillness. Measured footsteps reverberated through the cavernous space, each one deliberate, like the ticking of a clock counting down to an inevitable confrontation. Brad didn't lift his head. He didn't need to. The presence was unmistakably a force of nature cloaked in quiet authority. The scent of crisp linen and faint lavender drifted toward him, a stark contrast to the room's stale musk. "You're still here," Lauren's voice broke the silence, firm yet threaded with a strength that made every syllable feel like a stone dropped into still water. Her heels clicked softly against the chipped tiles as she drew closer, the sound steady and unhurried. "I figured you'd be halfway out the door by now. Most people bolt when the walls start closing in." Brad exhaled, a ragged breath that scraped against his throat. Slowly, he raised his head, bloodshot eyes meeting hers. The cocky tilt of his jaw, the swagger he'd always carried like a shield, had vanished, leaving behind a man who looked smaller, more fragile than he'd ever admit. "What do you want, Mitchell?" he rasped, his voice rough with exhaustion and something dangerously close to despair. "Haven't you already torn me apart enough?" Lauren's brow arched, a subtle flicker of surprise crossing her face before she folded her arms and leaned casually against a dented locker. The metal creaked under her weight, a faint groan that mirrored the tension in the room. "Torn you apart, that's a curious way to put it," she said, her tone dry but laced with an edge that cut through his self-pity. "You think this is about me settling a score, that I'm here gloating over your humiliation?" She paused, letting the question hang between them, heavy and unanswered. Brad shifted on the bench, his hands flexing and unflexing, nails digging into his palms as he searched for a response that wouldn't come. His silence was louder than any protest, a confession he couldn't voice. She stepped closer, her shadow falling across him, and when she spoke again, her voice softened not with pity, but with a clarity that made her words impossible to ignore. "This isn't about you, Officer Simmons, and it's not about me, either. It's about something bigger, something you've been too blind or too stubborn to see. It's about the people who suffer when someone like you, someone with power, lets their ego and their biases call the shots. It's about a system that's let you run wild for too long, turning a blind eye while you wielded that badge like a weapon instead of a duty." Her eyes locked onto his, unwavering, and Brad felt the weight of her gaze like a physical force, pinning him in place. He tore his eyes away, his jaw clenching until the muscles ached. Her words struck like hammer blows, each one chipping away at the flimsy excuses he'd built around himself. "You think you're flawless, don't you?" he muttered, bitterness seeping into his voice like venom. "Like you've never screwed up, never jumped to conclusions, never hurt anyone by mistake." Lauren's laugh was sharp and fleeting, a sound that held no warmth. Her expression hardened, eyes narrowing as she leaned in closer. "Flawless, is that what you think this is about?" she shot back, her voice rising just enough to make him flinch. "I've messed up plenty, Simmons. I've misjudged people, made calls I wish I could take back. But here's where we part ways. When I screw up, I face it. I don't duck behind authority or point fingers at the people I've wronged. I don't pretend the damage doesn't exist just to sleep better at night." Her words landed like a storm, fierce and unrelenting, and Brad's hands tightened around the edge of the bench, knuckles blanching as he fought to hold himself together. He surged to his feet, his movements stiff and unsteady, as if his body protested the effort. "So what now?" he demanded, his voice cracking despite his attempt to sound defiant. "You've made your case. The whole precinct's turned their backs on me. My career's in ashes. What else do you want from me?" His chest heaved, emotions warring within him: anger, shame, fear tangled into a knot he couldn't unravel. Lauren studied him, her face a mask of calm that betrayed nothing. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter, but its resolve was unshakable. "What I want," she said, each word deliberate, "is for you to get it. Not just what you did to me, but to every single person who's crossed your path and paid the price for your assumptions. That badge you've worn so proudly, it's not a free pass to play judge and jury. It's not a shield to hide behind when you degrade or hurt someone. It's a trust or responsibility. And if you can't carry it with honor, you've got no right to it at all." Brad's gaze dropped to the floor, his shoulders slumping as her words sank in, heavy as lead. For a moment, the room was silent, the air thick with unspoken truths. When he spoke again, his voice was barely a whisper, raw and trembling. "I didn't mean for it to go this far. I didn't mean to." He cut himself off, shaking his head as if the confession was too heavy to finish. Lauren's eyes softened, just a flicker, though her stance remained firm. "You didn't mean to get caught," she said quietly, her voice slicing through the silence with surgical precision. "That's the real truth, isn't it? You didn't plan on facing the fallout. But here you are. And what you do with this moment, it's going to define you. Not the uniform, not the title, you." He said nothing, his breathing uneven, chest rising and falling as he wrestled with the storm inside him. Lauren straightened, stepping back as if to give him space to breathe or to drown. She turned toward the door, her heels clicking a steady rhythm against the tile, but paused just before leaving. "Accountability isn't just punishment," she said, her voice steady and clear. "It's a chance to grow, to look at the ugliest parts of yourself and decide to do better. That's your call, Simmons. No one can make it for you." With that, she walked out, the echo of her footsteps fading into the night. Brad stood motionless, her words ringing in his ears like a bell tolling the end of something he couldn't name. For the first time, he felt the full weight of his choice, not just the consequences that had crashed down around him, but the lives he'd altered, the trust he'd broken. The silence that settled over him wasn't just in the room, it was a hollow space within, where his old certainties had crumbled to dust. Outside, Lauren emerged into the crisp evening air, the city sprawling before her under a sky streaked with fading light. A faint breeze brushed against her skin, carrying the distant hum of traffic and the rustle of leaves skittering across the pavement. She exhaled slowly, a sense of closure settling over her, though it was tinged with a quiet ache. This wasn't victory, not in the way most would see it. The fight wasn't over. There were still battles ahead, systems to challenge, changes to demand. But for now, she'd taken a stand, planted a seed of justice in a place too long overgrown with neglect. The rest, she knew, was up to him. The next morning, the precinct hummed with a subdued energy, a weight that clung to the air like damp fog. Officers moved through the halls with hushed voices, their usual camaraderie replaced by quick, furtive glances that avoided lingering too long. The hearing's shadow loomed over everything, seeping into the chipped paint of the walls and the scuffed linoleum floors. For Brad, the world had tilted off its axis. His desk, once a bastion of order and control, now felt like a gallows. Every eye in the room, a spotlight trained on his shame. He'd been suspended, a decision still pending final review, but allowed one last visit to clear out his belongings. Each item he picked: a faded coffee mug, a stack of yellowed reports, a brass nameplate felt like a piece of himself slipping away. The symbolic dismantling of an identity he'd clung to for years. The silence around him shattered as a familiar voice cut through the stillness. "You've got 5 minutes, Captain Hargrove said, his tone even but carrying the weight of finality. He stood in the doorway, arms crossed, his broad frame filling the space. His face was a study in contrast lines etched deep with disappointment, yet softened by something Brad couldn't quite decipher, a flicker of reluctant compassion. "Then we escort you out. You know the drill." Brad nodded, his movements sluggish as he slid a worn photo frame into the cardboard box at his feet. The image captured his first day on the Forciong, grinning, brimming with pride. Now, it felt like a relic from someone else's life. The captain lingered, then stepped into the room, his boots scuffing against the floor. "I've got to ask you something," he said, his voice dropping to a quieter register. "Do you regret it?" Brad's hand froze over the frame, his breath catching in his throat. He didn't look up, couldn't meet the captain's steady gaze. "I don't know anymore," he admitted, his voice barely audible, threaded with a confusion that gnawed at him. "I thought I was doing my job, keeping things in line, making the tough calls. I thought I was right, but now I don't know what I was." Hargrove sighed, a deep, weary sound, and leaned against the edge of a nearby desk. The wood creaked under his weight, a faint protest against the tension in the air. "You were handed power, Simmons," he said, his words measured but firm. "A badge, a trust. But power isn't about flexing muscle or calling shots. It's about knowing when to step up and when to hold back. Somewhere along the way, you forgot that. You let it twist into something it was never meant to be." Brad's fingers tightened around the frame, the glass cool against his skin. The captain's words landed like stones, each one sinking deeper into the cracks of his resolve. "What do I do now?" he asked, bitterness creeping into his tone. "No one's going to let this go. I can't just snap my fingers and undo it." The captain's expression softened, though his eyes remained sharp, piercing through Brad's defenses. "That's not my call to make," he said, his voice steady but carrying a quiet urgency. "That's on you. You've got to decide what kind of man you're going to be, someone who owns this mess or someone who keeps running from it. If you want my 2 cents, start by facing it. Not just for the people you stood in front of yesterday, but for yourself. Justice isn't just about paying a price, it's about what you build from the ruins." As Hargrove stepped away, leaving Brad alone with his box of fractured memories, the lesson lingered in the air, a stark reminder that power unchecked breeds chaos. And true accountability demands more than regret. It demands change. The air in the room hung heavy as Brad sat alone, the captain's departure leaving behind a void that seemed to swallow every sound. He didn't answer the unspoken questions lingering between them, his silence stretching out like a taut wire, vibrating with the tension of his own unraveling thoughts. The captain had risen from his chair with a slow, deliberate motion, his boots echoing faintly against the tiled floor as he exited, the door clicking shut with a finality that left Brad isolated. Time crawled forward, each minute a sluggish eternity, and as he packed his belongings into a worn duffel bag, the rustle of fabric and clink of metal filled the quiet. Yet beneath it all, a hollow ache gnawed at him, an emptiness that crept into his chest, a loss so profound he couldn't name it. It wasn't just the job or the badge. It was something deeper, a piece of himself he hadn't realized he'd surrendered until now. Meanwhile, across the sprawling city, Lauren Mitchell sat poised in her office, a fortress of determination amidst the chaos of the past few days. The late afternoon light filtered through the blinds, casting long, slanted shadows across her desk, where papers lay scattered like the remnants of a battlefield. Her focus was a steel thread, unbroken even by the emotional weight that pressed against her ribs, a weight born of the hearing that had shaken the department to its core. It had been a victory, yes, a tentative step toward justice, but Lauren knew it was merely the opening move in a much larger game. Brad's actious abuse of power, his arrogance, had ignited a firestorm of debate within the ranks, whispers of reform threading through the corridors like a fragile hope. She refused to let it die out, to let it become just another forgotten scandal. Her pen scratched against paper as she drafted proposals, her mind racing with ideas for systemic change that stretched far beyond one man's mistakes. This wasn't about settling scores. It was about dismantling a rotting foundation and building something better in its place. The buzz of her phone jolted her from her thoughts, the screen lighting up with a message from Emily, her assistant. Emily had been her eyes and ears in the aftermath, a quiet force navigating the storm with a diligence Lauren admired. The text was short, Almost curt, "Brad Simmons has requested a meeting." Lauren's breath caught, her fingers hovering over the phone as her mind churned. The request blindsided her, a curveball she hadn't anticipated. Part of her pragmatic, guarded part wanted to dismiss it, to see it as a waste of her precious time. But another part, the one forged in years of battling for accountability, recognized the flicker of possibility it carried. She typed back a response, her words clipped but decisive. "Schedule it." Later that afternoon, Brad approached the federal building with steps that faltered, each one heavier than the last. The structure loomed before him, its glass and steel facade reflecting the pale March sky, a mirror to his own uncertainty. The lobby, once a familiar hub of his daily routine, now felt alien, its polished floors and humming bustle transformed into a stage for his disgrace. He paused at the threshold, the weight of his shame pressing down like a physical force, his pulse thudding in his ears. The security guards stationed near the entrance watched him approach, their gazes sharp with recognition. One, a burly man with a graying mustache, tilted his head in a curt gesture toward the elevators, his eyes narrowing with a disapproval that stung more than words ever could. Another guard, younger and leaner, muttered something under his breath to his partner, a smirk tugging at his lips. Brad swallowed hard, his throat parched as he nodded and shuffled forward. The ride up to Lauren's office, a slow ascent into the unknown. When he stepped into her office, Lauren was already seated behind her desk, her presence commanding despite the simplicity of her posture. The room smelled faintly of coffee and ink, the walls lined with bookshelves that sagged under the weight of legal tomes and policy binders. She gestured to the chair across from her, a single, fluid motion, her face a mask of calm that gave nothing away. Brad lowered himself into the seat, his movements clumsy, his hands settling awkwardly on his knees as if unsure where they belonged. The silence between them thickened, a palpable barrier neither seemed eager to breach. He shifted slightly, the leather creaking beneath him, while Lauren's steady gaze bore into him, searching for something he wasn't sure he could offer. Finally, she spoke, her voice low and even, cutting through the tension like a blade. "You asked for this meeting, Officer Simmons. What do you want?" The title hit him like a slap, a reminder of what he'd lost. Its one sprout ring now hollow. He flinched, his Adam's apple bobbing as he struggled to find his voice. I wanted to apologize," he began, the words trembling as they spilled out, "for what I did, for how I treated you. I was wrong. I see that now. I don't expect forgiveness, but I needed you to hear it." Lauren leaned back in her chair, the faint creak of its springs punctuating the moment. Her eyes narrowed slightly, studying him with an intensity that made him feel exposed, as though she could peel back every layer of his guilt. "Do you understand why what you did was wrong?" she asked, her tone measured but piercing. "Or are you just sorry because you got caught?" The question landed like a blow, catching him off guard. He opened his mouth, then closed it, his thoughts scrambling for footing. After a beat, he drew a shaky breath and forced himself to meet her gaze, her dark eyes unyielding. "I think it's both," he admitted, his voice raw. "Getting caught it made me stop, made me look at myself, and I hate what I see. I spent so long convincing myself I was right, that I was doing my job, that I couldn't see the damage I was doing, to you, to others. I know I can't take it back, but I want to try to make it right." For a fleeting moment, something softened in Lauren's expression, a flicker of acknowledgement. Perhaps, but her voice remained steady, unyielding. "Making it right isn't about apologizing to me, Simmons. It's about changing who you are, how you see the world, how you wield the power you were given. Words are cheap. Real change, that's a battle." Brad nodded, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the chair's edges, anchoring himself against the truth of her words. "I know," he said quietly. "I'm not asking for anything from you. I just needed to say it to own it." Lauren regarded him for a long moment, her silence a test he wasn't sure he'd passed. Then she inclined her head, a subtle gesture of acceptance. "You've taken a step," she said. "But don't think this is the end. Accountability isn't a single moment, it's a road you'll walk every day." He rose to his feet, the weight in his chest shifting, not gone but lighter, a fragile hope threading through the uncertainty. As he left her office, the echo of his footsteps fading down the hall, He felt the stirrings of something new, a beginning he couldn't yet define. For Lauren, the encounter lingered like a quiet echo, a reminder of why she fought so fiercely. It wasn't about personal triumphs or fleeting apologies. It was about the slow, arduous possibility of transformation. Justice, she knew, was a lesson carved in consequences, a warning to those who abused their authority that the cost would always come due. The days that followed buzzed with a restless energy. Lauren threw herself into her work with a resolve that bordered on relentless. Her office a whirlwind of activity. Agents darted in and out, their voices overlapping in a symphony of urgency, while Emily juggled schedules and updates with a quiet efficiency that belied her youth. The proposals Lauren had crafted were gaining momentum, their pages worn from being passed between hands, sparking debates that had once seemed unthinkable. Progress was halting, met with pushback from those entrenched in the old ways. But Lauren thrived in the fight, her vigilance a shield against complacency. Brad, meanwhile, drifted in a sea of unstructured time, his suspension stripping away the rhythm of his former life. The precinct, once his anchor, now loomed in his mind as a place of judgment. The stares of his peers, some loyal, some scornful to heavy to face. Even beyond its walls, the city whispered his name, the hearing a topic that refused to fade. Late one evening, as the skyline glowed faintly beyond his apartment window, he sat in the dim light, replaying Lauren's words. Accountability isn't a moment, it's a process. They haunted him, not as blame, but as a mirror he couldn't turn away from. With a trembling hand, he reached for his phone and dialed her number, the call a lifeline he wasn't sure he deserved. Lauren was deep in a stack of case files when her phone vibrated. Brad's name flashing across the screen. She hesitated, her brow creasing, tempted to let it ring out, but instinct urged her forward, and she answered, her voice crisp. Simmons, on the other end. Brad faltered, the weight of his decision pressing against his ribs. Director Mitchell, he said, quieter than he intended. I hope I'm not interrupting. You are. She replied, not unkindly. So unless this matters, make it quick. He exhaled, steeling himself. I've been thinking about what you said about accountability, about change. I've started reaching out to community leaders, trying to understand where I went wrong. Not just that day, but all the ones before. I don't know if it means anything, but I'm trying. Lauren's expression softened, though her tone held firm. And what have you learned? His voice broke slightly as he answered, vulnerability seeping through. That I've been blind, that I let assumptions rule me instead of facts, that I've hurt people some I'll never fix. I'm not asking for pity. I need to do better. The line went quiet, the weight of his words hanging between them. A fragile bridge over a chasm of consequences neither could ignore. The silence stretched between them, a fragile thread pulled taut, quivering with the weight of unspoken truths. Lauren sat in her dimly lit apartment, the faint hum of the city beyond her window a distant murmur against the stillness within. Her fingers rested lightly on the phone, her breath slow and measured, as though she were steeling herself for what was to come. When she finally broke the quiet, her voice emerged soft but resolute, cutting through the heavy air like a blade tempered by years of resolve. Simmons, this isn't about wishing you could do better, she said, her tone steady yet laced with an undercurrent of weary frustration. It's about stepping up and actually doing it. Words are cheap, they roll off the tongue without cost. It's the actions that carry weight, the ones that demand something of you. Brad Simmons, on the other end of the line, sat hunched over in his sparsely furnished apartment, the shadows cast by a flickering lamp dancing across the walls. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped the phone, desperation seeping into his voice like water through cracked earth. I get that, Lauren, I do, he replied, the words tumbling out in a rush, raw and unpolished. That's why I reached out. I'm not just flapping my gums hooray, want to be part of fixing this. I want to make it right. But I'm lost, you know? You've been fighting this battle forever, Mabe. You could. His plea hung in the air, fragile and hopeful, but Lauren's response came swift and sharp, slicing through his words before he could finish. No, she interjected, her voice rising just enough to betray the edge of her impatience. This isn't my burden to hand off to you like some kind of lifeline. Simmons, this mess, it's yours. You made it. And you don't get to sidle up to me for a roadmap out of the wreckage after everything that's happened." She paused, letting the silence settle again, heavy with the memory of his failures. "If you're serious about repairing the damage you've caused, it starts with owning it. Not because I'm standing here telling you to, not because you want a pat on the back, but because it's the only decent thing left to do. You dig in, you do the real work." Brad fell silent, the sting of her words sinking deep into his chest, sharper and more piercing than he'd braced himself for. He stared at the cracked coffee table in front of him, its surface littered with empty takeout containers and a half-drunk glass of bourbon, relics of a life he no longer recognized. "You're right," he said at last, his voice quieter now, subdued by the weight of her truth. I needed to hear it out loud, from someone who gets it, someone who's seen the other side of this." Lauren sighed, the sound carrying the exhaustion of a woman who'd carried too much for too long. It wasn't just about this moment, it was the years of pushing against a system that bent, but never broke, the endless nights spent wrestling with the cost of her own convictions. "Understanding doesn't mean I'm letting you off the hook, Simmons," she said, her tone cooling as she spoke. "And it sure as hell doesn't mean I'm going to walk you through this step by step, like some kind of babysitter. But if you're truly in this, if you're not just blowing smoke, then start by shutting up and listening. Go to the people you've ignored, the communities you've trampled over, and just listen. Not to argue, not to justify yourself, but to actually hear them. And don't you dare expect them to forgive you. That's not something you're entitled to." Her words landed like stones, each one settling into the pit of Brad's stomach, their finality leaving no space for negotiation. He swallowed hard, the reality of what she demanded pressing down on him, a challenge not just to act, but to transform. "Thank you," he managed after a long, heavy pause, his voice rough with emotion, "for picking up the phone, for not sugarcoating it." "Honesty's the least you're owed," Lauren replied, her voice now icy. "A shield against any further pleas. Good night, Simmons." The line went dead before he could muster another word, the abrupt click reverberating through the stillness of his apartment like the closing of a door he couldn't reopen. He set the phone down slowly, his thoughts a tangled storm of guilt, resolve, and something uncomfortably close to fear. Her words hadn't been a comfort, they weren't meant to be. They were a gauntlet thrown at his feet, a stark reminder that justice wasn't a gift bestowed, but a labor earned. For the first time in his career, he felt the crushing weight of what accountability might actually demand of him. For Lauren, the call was another jagged piece in the sprawling mosaic of her fight that stretched far beyond one man or one misstep. She leaned back in her chair, staring out at the city lights flickering in the distance, each one a tiny beacon in the vast, unyielding dark. This wasn't just about Brad Simmons. It was about tearing down a machine that propped up men like him, a system that thrived on silence and complicity. She didn't soften for him, didn't offer the reassurance he might have craved, but buried deep beneath her steel resolve was a flicker of hope, not for her own sake, but for those who'd borne the brunt of his negligence. Maybe, just maybe, he'd take the path she'd pointed him toward, not because it was easy, but because it was right. As the night deepened, the city outside seemed to hold its breath, its streets cloaked in shadows that mirrored the uncertainty threading through both their lives. Their paths had collided not by design, but by the inescapable pull of consequence. Two souls tethered to the same reckoning. The road ahead loomed vast and treacherous, riddled with doubts and quiet terrors. But it was a journey neither could avoid. They would walk it separately, each grappling with the burdens of their own making, each searching for a way to step forward without pretending the past could be undone. In the days that followed, an uneasy stillness blanketed the city, as if it, too, were waiting for something to shift. Brad found himself adrift, stripped of the badge and the bravado that had once defined him. He ventured into unfamiliar corners, community centers, and back rooms where voices he'd once dismissed now rose to meet him. At first, the reception was a mixed bag. Some greeted him with tentative curiosity, others with raw, unfiltered contempt. Each encounter was a trial by fire, his very presence a spark igniting memories of pain and betrayal. But instead of shrinking back, he pressed forward, letting the discomfort settle into his bones, letting the words of those he'd wronged carve their way into his conscience. One such gathering took place in the basement of a weathered community center, its walls plastered with faded poster shanmid cries for justice and equality, their edges curling with age. Brad stepped inside, his hands buried deep in his coat pockets, fingers twitching with nervous energy. The air smelled faintly of mildew and coffee, and a small circle of people sat waiting, their faces etched with fatigue and a guarded resolve that made his stomach twist. Joseph, the group's leader, stood at the center, an older man with graying hair and eyes that held a quiet, unflinching strength. He gestured to an empty chair, his voice calm but firm. "Thanks for showing up," he began, though his expression offered no warmth, only a measured scrutiny. "But let's get one thing straight. This isn't about easing your conscience. This is about owning what you've done. You're here to listen, not to explain yourself away." Brad nodded, his throat tight as he searched for words that wouldn't sound hollow. "I get it," he said, his voice low and rough. "I'm not here to make excuses. I need to hear it straight from the people who've lived it. I need to understand what I've done." Across the circle, a young woman named Maya leaned forward, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her dark eyes narrowing as she studied him. "Do you, though?" she challenged, her voice sharp with skepticism. "Or are you just here because you got caught and you're scrambling to look like less of a monster?" The question hung there, thick and electric, the room's tension coiling tighter. Brad met her gaze, unflinching despite the heat rising in his chest. "I'm here because I've finally seen how wrong I was," he said quietly. "Not just about one moment, but about everything. And I know saying sorry doesn't cut it. That's why I'm here to listen, to learn, to figure out how to be better." Joseph raised a hand, his gesture a silent call for calm, though his eyes never left Brad. "Words are a start, Simmons," he said, his tone even but heavy with warning. "But they're nowhere near enough. You've got a mountain of work ahead, and it's not going to be pretty. People won't trust Yunit at first, maybe not ever. If you're serious, you'd better be ready for that." Brad nodded again, the gravity of Joseph's words wrapping around him like a shroud. The meeting stretched on, each voice weaving a tapestry of storyslivs bent and broken by the kind of power Brad had wielded so carelessly. He sat there, silent and still, the guilt clawing at him as fiercely as the resolve beginning to take root. Meanwhile, Lauren wrestled with her own storms. The fallout from Simmons' hearing had rippled through the FBI, stirring both praise and backlash in its wake. Some colleagues hailed her as a beacon of integrity, while others whispered accusations of disloyalty, their words laced with resentment for the spotlight she'd cast on their ranks. She'd grown used to the pushback, but it still wore on her, a constant ache she carried beneath her composed exterior. One evening, as she gathered her things to leave the office, her assistant Emily appeared in the doorway, a stack of papers clutched in her hands and worry etched across her face. "Director, you need to see this," she said, setting the documents on Lauren's desk with a quiet thud. "It's a report on disciplinary actiancer lack there are from Simmons' precinct. There's a pattern here, complaints buried, incidents hushed up. It's bigger than just him." Lauren's eyes scanned the pages, her jaw tightening as the scope of the rot came into focus. This wasn't a single bad apple, it was an orchard gone sour, nurtured by neglect and complicity. She looked up at Emily, her voice steady despite the fire simmering beneath it. "We're taking this to the deputy director. If we don't root this out, it'll just keep festering." Emily hesitated, her brow furrowing. "Are you sure? You're already catching Heathus could turn the screws even tighter." Lauren straightened, her resolve a steel beam in the storm. "If we don't push, nothing changes. I didn't sign up to play it safe." Set the meeting end of the week. As the days unfolded, Brad kept walking into the fire, seeking out conversations that stripped him bare. One night, after a grueling session where every word had felt like a lash, he found himself outside the precinct he'd once called home. The building loomed against the twilight sky, its brick facade cold and unyielding. He lingered there, the weight of memory pressing against his ribs, before stepping inside. The hallways echoed with a familiarity that now felt alien, the air thick with the ghosts of his past. He reached the captain's office, his knuckles brushing the door in a tentative knock, his heart pounding with the uncertainty of what lay beyond. In the dimly lit office of the precinct, Captain Reynolds lifted his gaze from the cluttered desk. his weathered face revealing a blend of astonishment and intrigue as his eyes met Brad Simmons. Standing in the doorway, the captain's bushy eyebrows arched slightly, betraying his surprise. "Simmons," he said, his voice gravelly yet warm, "I didn't expect you to darken my door today. What brings you here?" Brad stood rigid, his broad shoulders tense, his hands curling into tight fists at his sides as though bracing for a storm. He inhaled deeply, the air catching in his chest like a confession he wasn't sure he could release. "It's about the complaints filed against me," he began, his tone steady but laced with a tremor of vulnerability. "The ones that got buried, swept under the rug like they never happened. I need to talk about them." The captain leaned back in his creaky leather chair, the faint squeak echoing in the quiet room. His piercing gaze sharpened, cutting through the space between them like a blade. "You're stirring up a hornet's nest, Simmons," he warned, his words slow and deliberate. "You sure you're ready to face what's buzzing inside?" Brad's jaw tightened, but he nodded, a resolute glint flickering in his hazel eyes. "I don't have a choice," he replied, his voice growing firmer with each syllable. "I've spent too long running from this. It's time I own up to the mess I've made of the people I've hurt. If there's anyone out there I need to look in the eye and apologize to, anyone I need to make things right with, I'm ready to do it." For a long moment, the captain studied him, his weathered fingers drumming lightly on the desk as if weighing Brad's resolve. Then, with a slow nod, he spoke again, his tone softer but heavy with caution. "All right, then. But brace yourself, son. This isn't just about you and your mistakes. You're peeling back the lid on a system that's let a lot of folks down the system rotten with cracks. If you're serious about this, you'll be facing more than just your own ghosts." When Brad stepped out of that office, the weight of the conversation settled over him like a damp fog, heavy and inescapable. Yet, beneath that burden, a strange lightness flickered in his chest, a fragile spark of purpose he hadn't felt in years. The task ahead loomed enormous, a mountain of accountability he'd only just begun to climb. But for the first time, the path felt tangible, real. He could almost see it stretching out before him, winding through the wreckage of his past toward something meaningful, something worth fighting for. Meanwhile, across town, Lauren Carter pressed forward in her own relentless struggle. Her dark eyes burned with unyielding determination as she navigated a world that seemed to push back harder with every step she took. She stood in the midst of a crowded conference room at FBI headquarters, her slim frame commanding attention despite the chaos around her. The room buzzed with a mix of agents in crisp suits, community leaders with weary but hopeful faces, and journalists scribbling furiously in their notebooks. Months of tireless work had brought her months of battling resistance, of drafting reforms that clawed their way through layers of bureaucracy. New protocols were finally taking root, complaint procedures streamlined for clarity, transparency measures forcing sunlight into shadowed corners, and mandatory bias training chipping away at old prejudices. Lauren's voice, steady and resonant, cut through the noise as she addressed the crowd. "This isn't just about patching up what's broken," she said, her words carrying the weight of conviction. "It's about forging trust from the ground up. It's about building a culture where accountability isn't a threat, but a promise, where power serves to shield, not to wound. Change doesn't sweep in like a storm. It creeps forward, step by step, and it fights tooth and nail against those who cling to the old ways. But it begins with us right here, right now." The room erupted in applause, a wave of sound that crashed over her. But Lauren didn't linger in its warmth. Her focus remained razor-sharp, locked on the work still undone. As she moved through the bustling hallways afterward, her heels clicking against the polished floor, a rare swell of pride rose within her, not for herself, but for the fragile progress she'd witnessed, for the conversations finally breaking through years of silence, for the lives that might one day be spared the pain she'd seen too often. Brad's journey, too, had taken an unexpected turn. He sat now in a modest community center, the faint hum of fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Around him, a circle of teenagers sprawled in mismatched chairs, their faces a gallery of skepticism, curiosity, and guarded hope. This was his third time volunteering here, part of a program stitching fragile threads between law enforcement and a community long scarred by its failures. He hadn't been invited as a shining example, far from it. He was here because his story was a raw, jagged testament to what happened when accountability was dragged kicking and screaming into the open. Beside him stood Maya, a young woman with a fierce presence, her dark braids framing a face that radiated both strength and scrutiny. She'd confronted him months ago at his first meeting, her voice sharp with the pain of experience, demanding he prove his words weren't just empty noise. Now, she was his shadow, a constant reminder of the stakes. Brad cleared his throat, the sound rough in the stillness, and the room hushed as the teens turned their eyes to him. "I used to wear a badge," he started, his voice steady but threaded with a quiet ache. "For years. I thought that badge put me above the people I swore to protect. I thought it gave me power, made me untouchable. I was dead wrong. That badge wasn't about control, it was about trust, a trust I shattered again and again." The silence deepened, the weight of his confession sinking into the cracked linoleum floor. Maya stepped forward, her voice firm yet tempered with a hard-earned grace. "What he's saying isn't just his story," she said, her gaze sweeping the room. "It's about what happens when we let power run wild, when we stop asking questions and let bias fester. This isn't about feeling sorry for him. It's about making damn sure no one else has to live through the things too many of us have." Brad nodded, his voice dropping to a near whisper but carrying a resolute edge. "I'm not here begging for forgiveness. I don't deserve it, not yet. I'm here because I've got to earn back what I broke, even if it takes every day I've got left. I'm here to listen, to understand, to be part of something better than the man I was." Across the city, Lauren's phone buzzed with a message from Maya, a photo of Brad surrounded by those teens, his expression a mix of humility and resolve. The caption read, "People can change. Sometimes they just need to be forced to see themselves first." Lauren stared at the image, a faint smile tugging at her lips. She didn't know where Brad's road would lead, but for the first time, she felt a flicker of belief that he was walking it honestly. Months had passed since that pivotal hearing, its echoes rippling far beyond the precinct's grimy walls or the FBI's sterile corridors. The city hadn't transformed overnight, buildings still stood as they always had. Streets still hummed with the same restless energy, but something deeper had shifted. Brad's reckoning and Lauren's dogged pursuit of justice had sparked whispers in places where silence once reigned. Conversations bloomed in barbershops, on stoops, in crowded dinner, questions about power, about trust, about what it meant to hold those who wielded it accountable. Brad had left law enforcement for good, the badge no longer a fit for the man he was becoming. Instead, he poured himself into mending the relationships he'd fractured, awkward coffees with old colleagues, tearful apologies to families he'd wronged, quiet hours advocating for a system he'd once propped up without question. It was slow, often thankless work, but it tethered him to a purpose he'd never known before. The man who once strutted through life as if invincible now carried the heavy lesson of humility, understanding that true strength lay not in authority but in responsibility. Lauren's star rose higher, her name whispered in national circles as a beacon of integrity. But she kept her feet planted firmly in the mission that had always driven her. She knew change was a fragile thing, a flame that could gutter out without constant care. Yet she also knew it was real, and that certainty fueled her every step. Their stories, Brad's and Lauren's, wove into a broader tapestry, a stark reminder that accountability, though it cut deep, could carve a path to redemption. Justice, they'd learned, wasn't just about punishment. It was about facing consequences and building something better from the ruins. The misuse of power, left unchecked, eroded trust and scarred a lesson etched into their bones. Together, their journeys whispered a challenge to the world, to question the systems we lean on, to demand they serve rather than oppress, and to recognize that transformation begins not with grand gestures, but with the courage to confront what's broken. On a crisp morning in March, the sunlight filtered weakly through the curtains of a modest home nestled in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood. Inside, Mr. William Carter stood before a bathroom mirror that had seen better days, its edges chipped and tarnished by time. At 78, his reflection revealed a man whose dark skin bore the deep lines of a life richly lived, yet relentlessly tested. He smoothed the faded fabric of his shirt with trembling hands, each crease a testament to years of wear and care. His gaze dropped to the crumpled shopping list clutched in his palm, and his heart sank as it always did when he reached the familiar entry, adult diapers. The words stared back at him, a stark and unyielding reminder of the fragility that now defined his existence, and that of his beloved wife, Mary. Decades ago, this house had echoed with laughter and the vibrant energy of youth. William and Mary had built a life together here, their love a steady flame that warmed every corner of their small world. But time, cruel and unsparing, had dimmed that brightness. A devastating fall years earlier had robbed Mary of her strength, leaving her spine shattered and her body confined to a hospital bed that now dominated their once lively living room. The woman who had once danced with him under the stars, her laughter ringing like music, was now motionless, her world reduced to the four walls of their home and the unwavering devotion of her husband. William had become her everything, her nurse, her cook, her lifeline, ending to her every need with a tenderness that never wavered, even as it drained him to his core, changing her diapers, spoon-feeding her meals, guiding her through gentle exercises to keep her muscles from wasting away. These were acts of love. Yes, but they carried a weight that pressed heavily on his aging shoulders. That morning, as he prepared for his weekly trek to the store, William's movements were slow, deliberate, each step shadowed by a quiet dread. He didn't relish these outings. They were a necessity born of duty, not desire. Standing before Mary's bed, he adjusted the blanket over her frail form, his eyes meeting hers. She couldn't speak much anymore, but those eyes, bright and soulful despite her condition, spoke volumes. They held a gratitude so profound it nearly broke him, a silent acknowledgement of the sacrifices he made day after day. Leaning down, he pressed a soft kiss to her forehead, his voice a low murmur laced with affection. "I'm heading to the store, Mary. Won't be long." Her lips curved into a faint, weary smile, and for a moment, he saw the girl he'd fallen in love with all those years ago. It was enough to steel him for what lay ahead. With a deep breath, he shrugged into his threadbare coat, the fabric worn thin at the elbows, and gathered his reusable shopping bag, tattered but sturdy, much like himself. Stepping outside, the morning air hit him with a crispness that sharpened his senses, though it did little to lift the burden he carried. The street stretched before him, familiar yet daunting, leading to Simmons's grocery store, a place he'd frequented for years, but never quite grown comfortable entering. Each trip was a small battle, a test of endurance against the stares and whispers he couldn't shake from his mind. As he locked the door behind him, he cast a final glance at the house, its peeling paint and sagging porch a mirror to his own weariness, and set off with a resolve tempered by unease. The walk to Simmons's was short, but felt endless, every step heavy with anticipation. The store itself was a relic of the neighborhood, its narrow aisles dimly lit by flickering bulbs, the air thick with the scent of dust and canned goods. William knew its layout like the back of his hand, where the bread sat, where the canned soups were stacked, but that familiarity offered no comfort. When he approached his destination, the aisle of adult diapers, his pace slowed as he neared it, his heart thudding against his ribs. To him, it wasn't just a section of the store, it was a gauntlet of shame, a place where he felt exposed, vulnerable, judged. He imagined the eyes of strangers boring into him, their unspoken thoughts cutting deeper than words. An old black man, buying diapers, can't even care for himself, let alone his wife. The reality was far less dramatic. Only a handful of early shoppers wandered the aisles, but in his mind, the scrutiny was relentless, a spotlight he couldn't escape. When he finally reached the shelf, his hand hesitated before grasping a pack. The plastic crinkled loudly in the stillness, a sound that seemed to reverberate through the store like a siren, announcing his presence to anyone within earshot. His face flushed with heat as he clutched the package to his chest, shielding it as if it were a secret too shameful to bear. He moved quickly toward the checkout, head bowed, hoping to slip through unnoticed. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. As he joined the short line at the counter, a shadow loomed behind him, accompanied by a low chuckle that sent a shiver down his spine. Turning slightly, he caught sight of the source, a white police officer. His uniform crisp and authoritative, his face twisted into a smirk that dripped with malice. The man's voice boomed through the quiet store, deliberately loud, designed to draw attention. Well, look who we've got, hurrying old black man buying diapers. What's the story, huh, for yourself, or you just can't handle taking care of that wife of yours? The words landed like blows, each one striking at William's pride, his dignity, his very being. He stared at the floor, his grip tightening on the pack until his knuckles ached, willing himself to stay silent, to let it pass. But the officer wasn't done. Diapers, huh? Guess you're just a big baby now, growing old and turning right back into a kid. Pathetic. The laughter that followed was sharp and cruel, a sound that invited others to join in the humiliation. William felt the weight of every eye in the store turning toward him. Some customers glanced over with mild curiosity, their faces unreadable. Others didn't bother hiding their smirks, their contempt a silent echo of the officer's taunts. His cheeks burned not just from the embarrassment of his errand, but from the sting of having his race thrown in his face. A wound reopened after a lifetime of enduring such barbs. He'd faced prejudice before, more times than he could count, but at 78, the venom still cut as deeply as it had in his youth. The officer pressed on, his voice rising with arrogance. That's how it is with you people, isn't it? Poor when you're young, weak and useless when you're old. Can't even stand on your own 2 feet. Each syllable was a dagger, slicing through William's resolve, stirring a storm of shame and fury within him. He wanted to disappear, to flee this public execution of his worth, but his feet remained rooted, trapped by the need to see this through for Mary. Inside, he wrestled with a tempest of emotions. Anger surged hot and fierce, urging him to lash out, to defend the life he'd built and the love he carried. But shame held him back, whispering that he was too old, too frail, too powerless to fight. His silence wasn't surrender, it was survival, a shield against a world that had never fully seen him as a man. Yet just as the weight of it all threatened to crush him, a voice pierced the air, steady and unyielding, slicing through the tension like a blade. "Sir, that's not right, and you're not allowed to talk to him like that." The words came from Jacob, the young cashier behind the counter, a black man in his early 20s with a weary frame and a quiet intensity. His tone wasn't loud, but it carried a strength that silenced the store in an instant. The officer wheeled around, his eyes narrowing into a challenging glare. "What did you just say, kid?" He sneered, disbelief lacing his voice. Jacob didn't flinch, meeting the officer's gaze head-on. He replied, "I said you don't get to mock someone for their age or their race. Mister Carter deserves respect, same as anyone else here." His voice was calm but ironclad, a beacon of defiance in the dim light of Simmons's. The air grew thick, the silence palpable as every head turned toward Jacob. The officer's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of unease. William, still clutching the diapers, felt a swell of something unfamiliar, relief perhaps, or gratitude rising through the haze of his humiliation. Jacob wasn't just a cashier in that moment, he was a guardian. A young man who saw the injustice and refused to let it stand. The other customers shifted uncomfortably, their earlier amusement fading as the weight of Jacob's words settled over them. Here was a lesson in justice, raw and unfiltered. Power misused could wound, but courage, even from the humblest corner, could heal. For William, it was a lifeline, a reminder that dignity, once stripped away, could be reclaimed not just for him, but for Mary, whose love had sustained him through every trial. As the officer bristled, momentarily speechless, William straightened slightly, the burden on his shoulders just a fraction lighter. The air in the cramped little store hung thick with tension, heavy as the humid summer evening pressing against the windows. Mr. William Carter stood near the counter, his chest rising and falling with labored breaths, each one a shaky attempt to push down the sting of humiliation that had just been heaped upon him. His gnarled hands clutched a modest pack of diapers, something he'd picked up for his granddaughter, a small errand that should have been routine, but had spiraled into a public ordeal. The sting wasn't new to him. At 72, he'd weathered decades of sidelong glances, curt words, and outright disdain. But this time, in this dimly lit corner store, the weight of it all had crashed down harder, sharpened by the officer's mocking tone that still echoed in his ears. He'd felt small, exposed, the eyes of the other shoppers boring into him like silent accusations. And yet, As the shame coiled tighter round his heart, a voice cut through the haze. Jacob's voice, steady and clear, rising like a beacon in the murk. Jacob, the young cashier with a mop of dark hair and a demeanor too earnest for his 23 years, stood behind the counter, his gaze locked on the officer who'd unleashed the tirade. "Mr." William could still hear the venom in the policeman's words, dripping with contempt as he'd sneered at the elderly man's worn coat and unsteady hands. But Jacob hadn't wavered. His voice carried a quiet strength, not loud or brash, but firm enough to fill the room. "I know who you are," Jacob had said, his eyes never flinching from the officer's reddening face. "But that doesn't mean you get to stomp all over someone else's dignity." Each syllable landed like a stone, deliberate and unyielding, a direct challenge to the arrogance that had sparked this confrontation. For Mr. William, it was as if the fog of shame began to lift, replaced by a flicker of something he hadn't felt in yearship, fragile but growing, that fairness might still have a place in the world. The officer, a broad-shouldered man with a badge glinting under the store's flickering fluorescent lights, bristled at Jacob's defiance, his face twisted into a snarl, anger flaring in his narrowed eyes as he took a menacing step closer. The polished leather of his boots squeaked against the scuffed linoleum floor, a sound that seemed to amplify the tension crackling through the space. "Do you have any idea who you're talking to?" he barked, his voice booming with the weight of his authority. "I'm a police officer, a protector of this community. And you're nothing but a lowly cashier in this rundown hole." His words were meant to cut, to reassert the power he wielded like a club. But Jacob stood his ground. "Mr." William watched, his heart pounding, as the young man's resolve held firm, a quiet courage shining through the weariness in his eyes. "Your job is to serve, not to degrade," Jacob shot back, his tone even but edged with conviction. "You don't get to mock the vulnerable just because you wear that uniform." For a fleeting moment, the officer froze, his bluster punctured by Jacob's unflinching stand. The store, once a silent stage for Mr. Williams' humiliation, began to stir. The handful of customer shippers who'd lingered near the aisles, clutching their baskets and avoiding eye contact, shifted uncomfortably. A low murmur rippled through them, a mix of surprise and reluctant admiration. An older woman with a faded scarf tightened her grip on her purse, her lips pursed as she nodded faintly in agreement. A teenage boy, earbuds dangling from his neck, glanced up from his phone, his brows lifting as if seeing Jacob for the first time. The air itself seemed to change, charged with a new energy, not just of resistance, but of justice clawing its way to the surface. "Mr." William felt it too, a slow thaw in the icy grip of his shame, as if Jacob's words had cracked open a door he'd long thought sealed shut. The officer, though, wasn't ready to relent. His pride, wounded by this unexpected defiance, flared hotter. He leaned in, his breath hot and sour, his voice dropping to a growl. "You'll regret this, kid," he hissed, the threat hanging heavy in the air. His eyes darted to Mr. William, a sharp, cutting glare that made the older man's stomach twist, before he spun on his heel and stormed out. The bell above the door jangled violently as it slammed shut behind him, leaving a void of silence in his wake. It wasn't a peaceful quiet, but a dense, suffocating stillness, as if the room itself held its breath, waiting for the next move. Mr. Williams' hands trembled around the pack of diapers, his mind racing. Relief trickled in, mingling with a gnawing uneasy. New men like that officer didn't let challenges slide. The confrontation might have ended, but its shadow loomed large. Jacob turned to him then, his expression softening, the hard lines of determination melting into something gentler. "You didn't deserve that, Mr. Carter," he said, his voice low and warm, threaded with a respect that caught Mr. William off guard. "No one does." The words landed softly, like a bomb on a wound Mr. William hadn't realized was still raw. He tried to respond, but his throat tightened, choked by a swell of gratitude and something deeper, a recognition that this young man, barely more than a boy, had seen him, truly seen him, when others had turned away, for the first time that day. The crushing weight of embarrassment began to ease, replaced by a quiet awe. Jacob wasn't just defending him, he was rekindling a belief Mr. William had nearly lost that dignity mattered. That justice wasn't just a faded ideal from a bygone era. Around them, the store's other occupants grappled with their own reactions. The woman with the scarf shuffled closer, her eyes darting between Jacob and Mr. William. "Should have said something myself," she muttered, her voice rough with regret, though she offered Mr. William a small, apologetic nod. The teenager shoved his hands in his pockets, his earlier indifference giving way to a flicker of respect, as he watched Jacob return to the cash register. But no one had spoken up when it mattered, not when the officer's words had sliced through the air, not when Mr. William had stood there, shrinking under the weight of it all. Now, in the aftermath, their whispers felt hollow, their nods delayed. Mr. William sensed its awkwardness, the unspoken guilt, and it left a bitter taste. He'd seen this before, the way people rallied after the storm passed, but rarely during it. Jacob, though, carried on as if nothing extraordinary had happened. He slid back behind the counter, his fingers moving deftly over the register, though a faint crease of worry lingered on his brow. He wasn't naive. He knew standing up to a man with a badge could ripple back in ways he couldn't predict. The officer's parting threat echoed in his mind, a low hum of unease he couldn't quite shake, but regret that didn't cross his thoughts. He'd seen Mr. Williams' hunched shoulders, the way the older man's eyes had dropped to the floor, and something in him had snapped. Power didn't excuse cruelty, and silence didn't erase wrong. If there were consequences, he'd face them, but he'd sleep knowing he'd done what was right. The stillness shattered as Mr. Simmons, the store manager, burst from the back office, his footsteps quick and uneven. A weary man in his 50s, with graying hair and a perpetual frown. He carried the air of someone perpetually bracing for the next disaster. His eyes swept the room past the retreating customers, over Mr. Williams' still form, and landed on Jacob with a mix of exasperation and dread. "What the hell happened out here?" he demanded, his voice tight, fraying at the edges. "I just saw that officer storm out looking like he wanted to break something. You know he's a regular. Jacob brings in half his precinct on Fridays. What did you do?" The accusation hung there, sharp and pointed, and the remaining shoppers edged toward the door, eager to escape the brewing storm. Jacob looked up, his hands pausing over the register. Fatigue shadowed his eyes, but his resolve didn't waver. "I couldn't stay quiet, Mr. Simmons," he said, his tone steady despite the weight of the moment. He was tearing into Mr. William, mocking him for his age, his race, everything just because he could. "That's not right, badge or no badge." His words were simple, but they carried a quiet fire, a refusal to bend under the manager's glare. "Mr. Simmons blinked, caught off guard by the cashier's bluntness. He opened his mouth, then closed it, his mind racing to calculate the fallout. The officer wasn't just a customer. He was a symbol of authority, a connection to the local power structure. Losing that could mean trouble, complaints, maybe even retaliation. But as his gaze flicked to Mr. William, still clutching those diapers, he saw the toll of the encounter etched in the older man's lined face, and a flicker of doubt crept in. "You don't get it, Jacob," Mr. Simmons pressed, his voice dropping to a strained whisper, though the anger still simmered beneath. "This isn't just about right or wrong, it's about the store, our business. You've put us in a tough spot. Did you even think about that?" He rubbed a hand over his face, the lines deepening as he wrestled with the clash between practicality and principle. Jacob didn't answer right away, his silence deliberate, as if weighing the cost of his choice. "I get it," he said finally, his eyes meeting the manager's, "but I couldn't watch Mr. William take that and do nothing. Some things matter more than keeping the peace with the wrong people." Mr. William, who'd been a silent pillar through the exchange, felt a pang of guilt twist in his chest. He hadn't wanted this Jacob in the crosshairs, the store teetering on edge, all because of him. His legs ached from standing too long, his hands still trembling, but he couldn't stay quiet any longer. He stepped forward, the pack of diapers crinkling faintly as he set it on the counter. "Jacob didn't do anything wrong," he said, his voice deep and steady despite the tremor in his throat. He stood up for what's right, what everyone should have done. His eyes, clouded with years of hard-earned wisdom, met Jacob's, then Mr. Simmons's. "I've lived a long time, seen a lot. That officer didn't just poke at my age or my cloth, went after who I am. Jacob said what needed saying. The room stilled again, Mr. Williams' words sinking into the air like stones into a pond, rippling outward. The woman with the scarf paused near the door, her hand hovering over the handle, as if caught by the weight of his truth. The teenager lingered too, his earbuds forgotten, a flicker of understanding crossing his face. Mr. Simmons sighed, a long, weary sound, his shoulders slumping as the fight drained out of him. He couldn't argue with that, not with the raw honesty in Mr. Williams' voice, not with the quiet dignity Jacob had fought to preserve. "All right," he muttered, his tone softer now, though unease still clung to it. "We'll figure this out later." He forced a tight smile at Mr. William, a gesture of truce, but his mind was already spinning toward what might come next. An officer scorned, a community watching. Mr. William exhaled, his breath shaky, but lighter than before. The diapers sat on the counter, a small symbol of the ordinary life he'd been trying to live when the world had turned against him. He glanced at Jacob, who'd returned to his work with that same steady calm, and felt a swell of pride he hadn't expected. This wasn't just about one moment, one insult. It was a lesson carved deep into the day's fabric. Power could corrupt, could crush, but it didn't have to win. Not when someone, even a young cashier in a nowhere store, dared to stand against it. Justice, he realized, wasn't dead, it just needed a voice, and today, Jacob had given it one. The consequences might linger, the officer's shadow might return, but for now, Mr. William felt seen, and that was enough. The air inside Simmons's store felt thick and heavy as Mr. William stood at the counter, his weathered hands trembling slightly while accepting the shopping bags from Jacob. The cashier's words still echoed in his ears. "Carter, please finish your shopping. Everything you purchased today is on the house." A faint nod escaped Mr. William, a gesture born from a flicker of relief that danced briefly in his chest. Yet, beneath that fleeting comfort, a deeper unease gnawed at him, whispering that this moment was merely a pause in a much larger, unfinished tale. As Jacob handed over the bags, their fingers brushed for an instant, and Mr. William felt the unspoken tension pulsing between them, an electric current of shared understanding that neither dared to voice. Around them, the store hummed with the quiet rustle of other customers, their footsteps soft against the worn wooden floor. Mr. William could sense their eyes darting toward him, quick and cautious, like shadows shifting in the corner of his vision. Once, those gazes had carried sharp-edged judgment and mockery slicing through him when the officers' cruel words had rung out earlier. But now, something had shifted. The weight of their stares softened, tinged with a reluctant respect, perhaps even a trace of shame for their earlier silence. They hadn't spoken up when the officers' insults had cut deep, but Jacob had. That solitary act of defiance lingered in the air, reshaping the atmosphere like a stone dropped into still water. Mr. William adjusted the bags in his grip, their crinkling plastic a faint soundtrack to his slow shuffle toward the door. Each step felt deliberate, his worn shoes scuffing against the floorboards as though reluctant to leave this fragile sanctuary. But just before crossing the threshold into the crisp morning light, an impulse seized him. He stopped, his broad shoulders tensing, and turned back. Pride still ached within him, bruised from the officer's earlier scorn. Yet a warmth blossomed in his heart, a quiet, radiant glow that outshone the sting of humiliation. Today, a stranger named Jacob, a young man he'd met only moments ago, had stood tall for him when no one else would. It wasn't just the act itself that stirred him, it was the rarity of it, the courage it demanded in the face of power. Not everyone would dare to challenge a police officer, especially one whose authority loomed like a storm cloud over the small town. His eyes found Jacob behind the counter, the young man's calm demeanor betrayed by a flicker of worry creasing his brow. Mr. Williams' chest tightened as he approached, the bags swaying heavily in his hands. He stopped a few feet away, his breath catching as he searched for words to bridge the gap between them. "Thank you, Jacob," he said at last, his voice a low rumble, rich with a sincerity that seemed to surprise even himself. "You did something most folks wouldn't have the guts to do. I'm grateful, truly grateful that you stood up for me, for all of us who've been in my shoes." His gaze held steady, shimmering with appreciation. as though he could pour every ounce of his gratitude into that single look. Jacob's lips curved into a faint smile, though the worry didn't fully retreat from his eyes. For a moment, the tension in his face eased, replaced by a quiet resolve. "It's nothing, Mr. Carter," he replied, his voice soft but threaded with steel. "I just did what felt right. You didn't deserve that treatment, and I couldn't stand by and let injustice slide not when I had a voice to use." His words carried a weight beyond his years, a conviction that seemed to anchor him even as the shadow of consequence loomed. Mr. William nodded, his throat tightening as emotion swelled within him. This wasn't just a cashier standing before him. This was a young man with a heart forged in fire, unafraid to defend what mattered, even if it meant inviting trouble. To Mr. William, Jacob became more than a fleeting ally in a moment of need. He was a living testament to a new generation willing to confront the wrongs Mr. William had battled his entire life. "You know," he continued, his voice quivering as decades of buried pain bubbled to the surface, "all my life, I've faced this being looked down on, judged, marked just because of the color of my skin. But today, you didn't just save my dignity. You gave me hope, Jacob, hope that things can change, that there are still people out there willing to fight for what's right." Jacob stood motionless, absorbing every word as though they were kindling to a flame already burning within him. His eyes gleamed with a growing clarity, a silent vow that he'd made the right choice. "Consequences be damned, Mr. William felt the urge to say more, to pour out the torrent of thoughts swirling in his mind. But instead, he reached out, his hand, rough and lined with age, settled lightly on Jacob's shoulder, a touch so gentle yet brimming with unspoken meaning. "Thank you, Jacob," he repeated, softer this time, as if the words carried not just gratitude for the day's events, but a lifetime of longing for justice finally glimpsed. Jacob's smile widened, a spark of reassurance breaking through his earlier unease. "Mr. Carter, you head home now. Don't worry about a thing. If anything comes up, I'll handle it. As for that officer, sure, it might get rough, but I'll be fine." His tone was steady, almost defiant, a young man bracing himself for whatever storm might follow. But Mr. William couldn't shake the dread coiling in his gut. Jacob's bravery had lifted him up, yet it might cost the young man dearly: his job, his peace, maybe more. In a town this small, crossing the police was like spitting into the wind. The backlash could be swift and unforgiving. As he turned and stepped outside, the cool morning air brushed against his face, a fleeting balm for the turmoil within. Relief mingled with anxiety, a bittersweet brew that churned as he began the walk home. Jacob was a hero in his quiet, unassuming soul who'd faced down injustice without flinching. But heroes, Mr. William knew, often paid a price the world wasn't eager to spare. Each step along the cracked sidewalk felt heavier than the last, the bags swinging rhythmically at his sides as his mind churned. Jacob's future stretched out before him like an uncharted road, full of promise yet shadowed by risk. The young man had so much ahead of him, dreams perhaps, that reached far beyond the confines of this dusty town. Mr. William clung to a fragile hope that Jacob's courage wouldn't exact too steep a toll. But doubt gnawed at him. Justice, he'd learned long ago, was a fickle thing, often blind to those who fought for it most fiercely. When he reached his doorstep, he paused, the familiar creak of the porch beneath his feet grounding him for a moment. He drew a deep breath, the scent of dew-damp earth filling his lungs, and cast a lingering glance back toward the store. In his mind's eye, he saw Jacob standing firm, a beacon of light against the officer's looming shadow. A silent prayer formed in his heart. Not a religious man by habit, he still hoped the universe might tilt in Jacob's favor. Then, with a sigh, he pushed open the door and stepped inside. The quiet of his home enveloped him like a soft blanket, soothing the storm raging in his chest. Mary lay in her bed, her frail form propped against a mound of pillows. Her eyes, bright despite her illness, lit up as he entered with the bags, a wordless joy flickering across her face. He offered her a gentle smile, forcing the worry from his expression so she wouldn't sense the weight he carried. Setting the bags on the table, he eased himself into the chair beside her bed and took her hand, his thumb tracing slow circles over her fragile skin. "I'm back, Mary," he murmured, his voice a tender caress laced with an exhaustion he couldn't fully mask. Her gaze shifted, searching his face with that quiet intuition only she possessed. Though words had long since abandoned her, her eyes spoke volumes of curiosity, concern, a question she couldn't voice. Mr. Williams sighed, the sound heavy in the stillness, and decided she deserved the truth. He began to recount the morning's events, his voice low and steady at first, describing the officer's venomous words and the sting of humiliation that had pierced him. But when he spoke of Jacob, his tone softened, warmed by a reverence he couldn't suppress. "He stood up for us, Mary," he said, his eyes growing distant as he relived the moment. "This young man I'd never met before he faced that officer down without a second thought. But I'm scared for him now. He's so young, and doing what's right shouldn't bring him trouble, yet I know it might." Mary's eyes softened, a tender glow within them as though she sought to ease his burden. He knew she felt it to the worry, the guilt that gnawed at him for being the spark that had ignited Jacob's risk. If not for him, Jacob might have stayed silent, safe. Yet because of him, the young man now stood on a precipice, vulnerable to a system that rarely rewarded defiance. That night, sleep eluded Mr. William. He lay beside Mary, her shallow breaths a faint rhythm in the dark, while his mind spun with images of Jacob's steady stance, his unwavering voice, the officer's cold glare, the thought of Jacob losing his job, or worse, facing retaliation, twisted like a knife in his chest. He'd seen too many good souls crushed by the weight of power to believe this would end easily. Before dawn painted the sky, Mr. William rose, resolve hardening within him. He couldn't sit idle while Jacob faced the fallout alone. Slipping on his coat, he stepped into the gray morning, his heart pounding with a mix of dread and determination. The walk back to Simmons's store felt endless, each breath sharpening his anxiety. He pushed open the door, eyes scanning for Jacob's familiar figure behind the counter. But the space was empty. A young woman stood there instead, her hands busy with a stack of receipts. His pulse quickened as he approached, a sinking feeling rooting in his bones. "Hello, ma'am," he said, his voice rough with urgency. "Where's Jacob?" She glanced up, hesitating as though weighing her words. "Jacob hasn't come in today," she replied, her tone faltering. "Actually, he hasn't been here since yesterday. I don't know what happened, but it seems he's in trouble after that run-in with the officer." Her words struck him like a physical blow, confirming the fears that had haunted him through the night. The officer hadn't let it go. Jacob's stand noble. Reichausch had unleashed a storm Mr. William hadn't wanted for him. Guilt surged, bitter and overwhelming, as he pictured Jacob facing the consequences alone. A lost job, a tarnished name, or worse, the officer's wrath in a town where power bent justice to its will. He stood frozen, the store blurring around him, as the lesson sank deep into his soul. Justice was a double-edged sword, beautiful in its pursuit, brutal in its cost. Jacob had wielded it bravely, but the fallout revealed a truth Mr. William knew too well. Those who abused power rarely faced the mirror, while those who challenged it bore the scars. He vowed then, silently, to find Jacob, to stand by him as the young man had stood by Himbakaus in a world so quick to punish the just. No one should face the consequences alone. The crisp morning air brushed against Mr. William Carter's weathered face as he stepped out of the little store, his mind a storm of worry and guilt. If it hadn't been for him for that moment when Jacob stepped in to shield him from trouble, the young man wouldn't be suffering now. Jacob had done what was right, standing tall against injustice like a lone oak in a windstorm. Yet here he was, paying a steep price for his courage. Mr. William's heart twisted painfully at the thought. He had to find a way to help, to lift the burden from Jacob's shoulders. But how? His mind churned with questions, each one heavier than the last, and no answers came to ease the ache in his chest. Inside the store, a young woman with kind eyes had watched him leave. She'd seen the lines of concern etched deep into his face, the way his shoulders slumped under an invisible weight. "I'm very sorry, Mr. Carter," she'd said, her voice soft as a whisper on the wind, tinged with genuine regret. "I don't know much more, but I hope Jacob will be all right." Her sympathy lingered in the air like a faint melody, and Mr. William had managed only a curt nod of thanks before turning away. Words felt useless when the person who'd saved him was drowning in consequences he didn't deserve. Outside, the world carried on as if nothing had changed. The breeze rustled the leaves along the quiet street, and the sun peeked through the clouds, casting a golden glow over the town. But for Mr. William, the beauty of the day was lost in the turmoil swirling within him. Jacob had stood up for justice, had put himself in harm's way to protect an old man he barely knew, and yet fairness, so-called fairness, had turned its back on him. Why did doing the right thing come with such a brutal cost? As he trudged home, his boots scuffing against the uneven pavement, his thoughts spun endlessly. Would Jacob be okay? Had he lost his job at the store? Would that officer, with his cold eyes and iron grip, seek revenge? Each question gnawed at Mr. William, leaving him restless, his soul unable to settle. Days passed, and Mr. William found himself returning to the store like a moth drawn to a flame, hoping against hope to catch a glimpse of Jacob's familiar figure behind the counter. Each time, though, the employees' faces he'd come to know, but whose names he never remembered, offered the same hollow reply: Jacob hasn't come to work. Their voices were flat, tinged with unease, as if they, too, sensed something was terribly wrong. With every visit, the knot of worry in Mr. Williams' gut tightened, his imagination running wild with possibilities, each darker than the last. He couldn't just stand by, wringing his hands while Jacob suffered. Inaction wasn't in his nature, not when someone he cared about was in peril. One warm afternoon, the sun hanging lazily in a sky streaked with wisps of white, Mr. William decided to break from routine. Instead of taking his usual path home, a quiet, tree-lined street that wound past familiar house veered toward the town's modest shopping district. The idea had struck him like a spark. Maybe, just maybe, he'd stumble across Jacob by chance. The streets buzzed with life, shoppers weaving between storefronts, children laughing as they darted past, vendors calling out their wares. Yet, amid the clamor, Mr. William's world narrowed to a single, desperate question: where is Jacob? His eyes scanned every face, every shadow, searching for a sign. Then, as if fate had finally taken pity on him, he saw a figure slumped against the wall of a shuttered shop, half hidden by the crowd. The young man sat on the curb, his thin frame swallowed by a threadbare coat, his head bowed as if the weight of the world pressed down on his shoulders, even from a distance. Mr. William knew it was Jacob. His heart clenched, a sharp pang of sorrow cutting through him at the sight of the boy's defeated posture. Quickening his pace, he wove through the throng, his old legs protesting, but his determination overriding the ache. As he drew closer, Jacob lifted his head, his tired eyes catching the light. They were dulled by exhaustion, shadowed with a flicker of shame that made Mr. Williams' chest tighten further. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence hung heavy between them, thick with unspoken emotion, surprise, embarrassment, and something deeper, something raw. Jacob broke it first, his voice raspy and faint, like a candle struggling to stay lit. "Hello, Mr. Carter," he murmured, a sheepish half-smile tugging at his lips. "I'm sorry, I didn't want you to see me like this." Mr. William eased himself down onto the curb beside him, ignoring the stiffness in his knees. The cold concrete bit into his bones, but he didn't care. Right now, Jacob needed to know he wasn't alone, that someone still saw him, still cared. "It's all right, Jacob," he said, his tone warm and steady, a balm against the young man's quiet despair. "I'm the one who should be apologizing. If it weren't for me, you wouldn't be in this mess." Jacob shook his head, a faint spark of defiance breaking through his weariness. "No, Mr. Carter, it's not your fault," he insisted, though his voice trembled with the effort to hold himself together. "I stood up for what was right." He paused, his gaze dropping to the cracked pavement beneath his feet, as if the rest of his story was too heavy to voice. But Mr. Williams' gentle, unwavering stare coaxed him on, a silent promise that he could unburden himself here, with this man who'd become more than just a stranger he'd once helped. After that day at the store, Jacob continued, his words slow and halting. "That officer filed a complaint with the manager, said I'd caused a scene. Then they told me other customers had complained, to say I'd tarnished the store's good name. In the end, they fired me." His shoulders slumped further. as if reliving the moment drained what little strength he had left. They claimed I'd ruined their reputation. Mr. William felt a surge of anger bubble up inside him, hot and fierce, but it was quickly swallowed by a tide of guilt and sorrow. His worst fears had come true. Jacob had lost his livelihood, all because he dared to stand against a bully in a uniform. "Jacob, I'm so sorry," he said, his voice thick with remorse, each word laced with the weight of his regret. Jacob managed a faint, bittersweet smile, the kind that spoke of resilience even in the face of ruin. "Losing the job wasn't even the worst of it, Mr. Carter," he admitted, his tone growing quieter, more fragile. "My life was already falling apart before that. I'd lost my home months ago, and after they let me go, I had nowhere to turn. I've been trying to find work." Anything but his voice faded into the hum of the street, his eyes drifting to some distant point, lost in the haze of his despair. "I've lost everything," he whispered, the confession hanging between them like a ghost. "But I don't regret what I did that day. If I had to, I'd stand up for you again." Those words struck Mr. William like a thunderclap, reverberating through his soul. Here was Jacob uttered, broken, stripped of everything, yet still clinging to the belief that justice was worth fighting for. It was a courage that humbled the old man, stirring a mix of gratitude, admiration, and a fierce resolve deep within him. "You did the right thing, Jacob," he said, his voice firm with conviction, "and I won't let you carry the cost of that alone." Jacob blinked up at him, startled, his brows knitting together in confusion. "You don't have to do anything, Mr. Carter," he protested weakly. "I'll manage. I just need some time to figure things out." But Mr. William wouldn't hear it. The young man's selflessness had saved him once, and now it was his turn to step into the breach. "No, Jacob," he said, his tone brooking no argument. "You don't have to face this by yourself. You stood up for me when I was powerless, and now I'm going to stand by you." A fire kindled in Mr. William's chest, a determination he hadn't felt in years. He might not have much as savings were meager, his resources thin, but he couldn't let Jacob slip further into the abyss. Reaching out, he placed a steady hand on the young man's shoulder, the gesture gentle yet unyielding. "Come with me, Jacob," he said softly. "Come home with me. Mary and I have a spare room, and we'd be glad to have you stay with us. You don't have to go through this alone anymore." Jacob stared at him, his breath catching as if the offer were too vast, too generous to comprehend. "Mr. Carter, I can't," he stammered, shaking his head. "I don't want to burden you and Mrs. Carter." But Mr. William cut him off with a smile, one that radiated warmth and quiet strength. "There's no burden here, Jacob," he said. "You helped me when I needed it most, and now I'm just returning the favor. We'll get through this together." For a long moment, Jacob said nothing, his eyes searching Mr. William's face as if looking for a catch, a reason to refuse. But all he found was sincerity, a lifeline extended in the midst of his storm. Finally, his defenses crumbled, and a shimmer of hope, faint but real, flickered in his gaze. "Thank you, Mr. Carter," he murmured, his voice breaking with emotion. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Mr. William replied, rising slowly to his feet and offering Jacob a hand. "Just come home with me." And so they walked together, the old man and the young one, down the winding path toward a modest house that waited to welcome them. For Mr. William, the weight that had pressed on his heart began to lift, replaced by the quiet joy of knowing he wasn't just saving Jacob, was gaining a companion, someone to share the load of life's trials. For Jacob, the world felt a little less cold, a little less lonely, as if the shadows that had dogged him were finally beginning to recede. When they reached the house, Mr. William pushed open the creaky door, ushering Jacob into a space that was small but alive with warmth. The furniture was worn, the rugs faded, but every corner whispered of care and resilience. Jacob hesitated at the threshold, his breath catching as the scent of old wood and faint lavender washed over him, a stark contrast to the damp, unforgiving streets he'd wandered for days. Inside, Mary Carter lay propped up in her bed near the window, her frail frame a testament to years of quiet endurance. Her eyes, sharp despite her weakened state, flicked toward the newcomer, curiosity dancing in their depths. Mr. William crossed the room to her side, taking her thin hand in his own. "This is Jacob, Mary," he said, his voice tender but steady. "He's the young man who helped me at the store that day. He's going to stay with us for a while." He squeezed her hand, a silent plea for her understanding, knowing she'd see the truth in his heart as she always had. Mary's gaze shifted to Jacob, lingering there for a moment before she offered a faint nod, her lips curving into a weak but welcoming smile. Jacob stepped forward, his head dipping in a gesture of respect. "Hello, ma'am," he said, his voice soft but earnest. "It's a pleasure to meet you. I'll do whatever I can to help you both." There was a sincerity in his tone, a promise woven into the words, and it eased the last of Mr. Williams' worries. He led Jacob to the spare room, a small, unassuming space with a single bed, a chipped wooden dresser, and a window that let in the soft glow of the afternoon sun. To Jacob, it was a palace, after nights spent shivering under bridges and curled up in alleyways. The sight of a clean blanket and a pillow brought a lump to his throat. "I don't know how to thank you, Mr. Carter," he said, his voice thick with gratitude. It's too much." Mr. William chuckled softly, clapping him on the shoulder. "It's nothing, Jacob. Having you here is a blessing to us. Make yourself at home." In the days that followed, Jacob settled into the rhythm of the Carter household. Though he moved with the caution of a guest afraid to overstay his welcome, he didn't want to impose, didn't want to tip the delicate balance of their lives. But Mr. William and Mary wouldn't have it. They treated him like kin, their kindness chipping away at the walls he'd built around himself. Soon, Jacob found himself pitching and fixing a leaky faucet with tools he unearthed from the shed, coaxing life back into the overgrown garden, sitting with Mary when Mr. William's back ached too much to stand. His presence lightened the load Mr. William had carried alone for so long, turning solitary chores into shared moments of quiet companionship. Through it all, the lesson of Jacob's ordeal lingered in Mr. William's mind, a stark reminder of justice's double-edged blade. Power, when wielded without mercy, could crush the innocent as easily as it punished the guilty. Yet in Jacob's unwavering resolve, in his refusal to bow despite the cost, Mr. William saw hope, a testament to the strength of those who dared to stand for what was right. Together they forged a bond not just of gratitude, but of mutual redemption, proving that even in the shadow of consequence, compassion could carve a path to healing. In the quiet afternoons, the Carter household began to stir with a new vitality, a breath of life that hadn't been felt in years. It was during those golden hours, when the sun dipped low and cast long shadows across the weathered porch, that Mr. William first noticed the change. He'd sit there, rocking gently in his chair, the creak of the wood blending with the soft hum of the world settling into dusk. Beside him sat Jacob, a man whose presence had crept into their lives like a slow, steady tide. They'd talk for hours, their voices weaving tales of days long gone, stories of triumph, sorrow, and everything in between. Jacob's words carried the weight of a life hard-lived, the chaos of military service, where he'd faced the roar of battle and the silence of loss, the sting of his wife's betrayal, a wound that festered long after she'd gone, and the relentless grip of addiction, a demon that had stripped him bare, leaving him with nothing but the clothes on his back and a heart full of regret. Yet, as Mr. William listened, his admiration only grew. There was something raw and honest in Jacob's confessions, a flicker of resilience that refused to be snuffed out, and it stirred a quiet pride in the older man's chest. Jacob wasn't just a pair of hands to help around the house, was a spark, igniting something dormant in the Carter's world. The garden bloomed under his care, the floors gleamed with a polish they hadn't known in years, and the air felt lighter, as if the burdens of time had been swept away with the dust. But it wasn't just the physical labor that mattered. It was the way Jacob began to look inward, to dream of something more. One afternoon, as the two men sat watching the flowers sway in the breeze, Jacob's voice broke the stillness. "Mr. Carter," he said, his tone heavy with a mix of resolve and vulnerability. "I've been thinking a lot lately. I don't want to keep living like this, droning in a bottle, waking up to the same emptiness. I want to change. I want to get sober, start over, build something worth having." His hands fidgeted in his lap, betraying the storm of doubt and hope warring within him. Mr. William turned to him, his eyes soft but steady, like a lighthouse cutting through fog. "Jacob," he replied, his voice warm with encouragement. "I'm so proud of you for saying that. Recognizing if it's the hardest part, and you won't be walking this road alone. I'll be right here, every step of the way." The words hung between them, a promise sealed in the fading light. With Mr. Williams' unwavering support, Jacob took his first trembling steps toward redemption. He started attending group meetings, gatherings of souls just as battered as he was, all clinging to the fragile thread of hope. Each session was a battlesome daze. The cravings clawed at him like a wild animal, and the shame of his past loomed large, whispering that he'd never be more than his mistakes. But slowly, day by day, he grew stronger. His body shed the tremble of withdrawal, and his mind began to clear, revealing a man who'd been buried beneath years of pain. He threw himself into caring for Mary, Mr. Williams' wife, whose frail frame and quiet demeanor hid a spirit that still glowed faintly. Jacob learned to cook her meals, his clumsy hands fumbling with recipes until he mastered them. He carried her to the porch when she wanted to feel the sun, his arms steady and sure. Every small victory fueled him, proving he could be more than the wreckage he'd once been. But Jacob's transformation didn't stop at sobriety. With Mr. Williams' gentle nudging, he set his sights on a new horizon, a job, a purpose beyond the Carter home. The old man sat with him late into the night, poring over applications, dusting off skills Jacob had honed in the military skills he'd thought useless in a civilian world. It wasn't easy, rejection stung, and doubt crept in like a shadow. Yet Jacob persisted, driven by a fire Mr. William had helped him rekindle. After weeks of effort, he landed a position as a maintenance technician at the local community center. It was humble work fixing leaky pipes, patching walls, keeping the place running, but to Jacob, it was a lifeline. The steady paycheck was a comfort, but the real reward was the way people looked at him, not as a failure, but as someone dependable, someone who mattered. The center's staff grew to love him, his quiet humor, his willingness to lend a hand, the way he'd stay late to help a struggling co-worker. He wasn't just rebuilding his life, he was laying a foundation, brick by brick, solid and true. Through it all, Mr. William watched like a guardian angel, his presence a constant, quiet strength. He'd seen the potential in Jacob from the start, a young man battered by life but not broken, deserving of a second chance. And as the days turned to months, Jacob became more than a helper, it became family. Mary felt it too. Though her voice had been stolen by illness, her eyes spoke volumes. When Jacob adjusted her blanket or sat chatting with her husband, a soft smile would bloom on her face, a silent blessing from a woman who'd known too much loss. To her, Jacob wasn't just a caretaker. He was the son she and Mr. William had never born, a gift delivered by fate to fill the empty spaces in their hearts. Their home, once a mausoleum of loneliness and fading memories, now hummed with warmth. Laughter echoed where silence had reigned, and the weight of isolation lifted, replaced by a sense of belonging that wrapped around them like a well-worn quilt. Life settled into a rhythm of stability, a fragile but beautiful dance. Jacob thrived at the community center, his confidence blossoming with every task he mastered. He'd come home homemade of the Carter's little house, greeted by the smell of Mary's favorite tea brewing and Mr. Williams' voice calling out a welcome. The three of them would sit together in the evenings, the garden stretching out before them as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. One such night, as crickets chirped and a cool breeze rustled the leaves, Mr. William turned to Jacob, his voice thick with emotion. "You know, Jacob," he said, his gaze steady, "you're not just someone who helps us out. You're part of this family now. Mary and I see you as our son, as real as if you'd been born to us." The words hit Jacob like a wave, crashing through the walls he'd built around his heart. He looked up, his throat tight, eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Thank you, Mr. Carter," he managed, his voice rough but earnest. "You and Mrs. Mary, you've given me more than a roof over my head. You've given me hope, a reason to keep going when I thought I'd lost it all." Mary reached out, her trembling hand resting on his, her eyes shining with a joy that needed no words. Their bond deepened into something sacred, a connection forged not by blood but by shared struggles and unspoken sacrifices. Jacob's past betrayals, the bottles, the nights of despair faded into the distance. replaced by mornings of purpose and evenings of love. He didn't just find a family, he found himself. A man capable of rising from ashes he'd once thought would bury him, and in doing so, he brought light to Mr. William and Mary, who'd spent along in the shadow of their own quiet grief, together. They faced life's challenges not as three separate souls, but as a unit, bound by empathy and kindness. The garden flourished, the house stood prouder, and their laughter became a melody that drowned out the echoes of pain. This journey wasn't just about redemption, it was a lesson in justice, a testament to the consequences of power misused and the healing that comes when it's wielded with care. Jacob's addiction had once held him captive, a tyrant born of his own choices, stripping him of dignity and hope. Mr. William could have turned him away, wielded his authority as homeowner to reject a broken man. Instead, he chose compassion, offering a hand instead of a judgment. That choice rippled outward, transforming not just Jacob, but all three of them. It was a quiet rebellion against a world that often discards the fallen, a reminder that true power lies in lifting others up, not tearing them down. Their story whispers to us across the divide, in the darkest moments, when despair seems absolute. A single act of grace, a word, a gesture, a belief in someone's worth can spark a miracle. Family isn't confined to lineage, it's built on understanding, on seeing the humanity in another and choosing to stand beside them. Life will always bear its burdens, but with love and courage, those burdens grow lighter. And from the ashes of hardship, a brighter future can rise.